All right, everybody, we are at the Mobile Hunters Expo, the Northern Show here in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Very excited for this episode. For our first episode, our first segment of this episode, we've got Andy May on the podcast. Andy, how you doing, brother?
Doing good.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Good show, huh?
Yeah, dude, it's unreal. It's a room full of killers. We were at the Southern Show, and of course, at the Southern Show, you had this a room full of guys from the Southeast that are just big buck killers, very high IQ when it comes to whitetail IQ. And here's the exact same. Just the bucks are a lot bigger up here, so it's it makes it a big difference. I'm talking to some of these guys that are like in their mid-20s, and they're, hey, I mean, I killed this 163 and a couple 150s, and they're showing me photos. I'm like, holy crap! I'm like, you got guys in the Southeast that, every now and then you might have an opportunity at that, but it's a very small fraction of percent of people has actually had that opportunity.
Different world.
It's all relative to where you're at.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like I was telling guys earlier that down in Alabama, there's a very good chance you could kill a buck that's, a mature buck. He's 5.5 years old. He might be 105 inches, 110 inches. Yeah. And then every now and then you get that one that breaks that 130 mark. You're like, this is awesome, man.
That kind of sounds a little more like northern Michigan. I mean, it's changing a little bit up there. They got some antler point restrictions that have been in place, so it's getting better, but that up there, you get into kind of that northern, lower peninsula, even to the UP, you get a lot of those old bucks that don't really grow big trophy racks. 100 inches, 110 inches, big kind of like heavy 8s with short beams.
Short tines. Yeah, dude, that's an Alabama special, dude.
Yeah.
So I got to ask, so the whole kind of series with this episode with everybody I'm going to interview is very similar to what I did at the Southern Show, which is I want to learn a little bit more about you, of what has been like one of the biggest factors for you when it comes to having consistent success, targeting mature bucks, especially as you travel, because I know you traveled a bunch of states every year.
Yeah. I think I hunted my 19th state just recently. So
wow, okay.
I've been around, not all for whitetail, but most of them.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to put a finger on it, but this is what is my opinion. I grew up hunting here in Michigan. In the southern lower portion of Michigan, we have 70% of our hunters. So Michigan has a lot of hunters. PA actually has more hunters than Michigan, but in PA, it's spread out across the entire state. Where in Michigan, 70% is in our southern lower, right where I hunt. So it's the ultimate high pressure. Very hard to get on mature deer, very hard to find them. And the guys that do consistently, they live it. They're out there searching, they're grinding, they're putting in just next level effort. And I grew up, this was my training grounds, trying to find mature deer in southern Michigan. We can get some big deer if they can get some age. The hardest thing is just getting the age, like a 2 or 3 year old buck. Sometimes he's the biggest buck in the block, so it's a lot different than other states, but because you have to put in that next level effort, and it's kind of what I grew up doing. The second I crossed state lines into any state, it was a different world. Even states that are considered high pressure, like Ohio, I went to Ohio and I was like, holy cow. Not that I thought it was easy, but there was way better age class, more bucks of age class. So yeah, it had this perception of being easier. It still was very hard to kill a 4 or 5 year old buck, but there was just more of them around. So I think for me personally, the biggest thing was growing up and hunting southern Michigan and learning to be successful here in a very difficult environment, high competition with all these guys. Access is tough. So it's like really the guys that are putting forth the next level, they kind of rise to the top. And you throw them in an environment where there's a little less pressure, a little more bucks. It's like, yeah, you're going to have success, high success, and be real efficient. So, I started going to Ohio, and then I started going to Illinois, and then I drew an Iowa tag. And yeah, I wasn't necessarily going there and killing 180-inch bucks in a couple days, but a lot of times because of my career, I would drive down for the weekend, and I'd have 2 days to hunt, 3 days. So I'm kind of known for that. I work at a school, and I don't get vacation time, so I would travel like kind of weekend warrior type stuff, maybe call in sick on a Monday or whatever. But so a lot of my hunts were those 2 to 4 days. That was like my window. And I was getting it done at a very high rate on good deer. I wasn't killing, maybe the biggest one in the block, but I was killing nice mature deer out of state on a quick hunt, and that was good enough for me. And then I think too, I think I have more of an aggressive approach. And I'm not a very timid hunter, and I'm not afraid to get in there and mix it up. And I think that lends well to kind of developing your instincts as a hunter. So I've been hunting a long time. I'm 45 years old, but I've hunted 19 states. I've hunted, all across the country, and I don't necessarily even have a style. My style is to be aggressive and to push the envelope, and because that's always been my style, I've made a ton of mistakes, and I probably make more mistakes than anybody in here. Like, don't tell them all that, but I do. I mean, I really do. I bump deer all the time. I make mistakes, but because of my aggressive approach, I'm always pushing the envelope. I create more opportunities. So out of all my friends, and even a lot of the guys here, I get more opportunities at good bucks than most of them because of my style. But I'm also screwing up more. I'm always pushing maybe a little too hard sometimes. But I'm making those opportunities, and inevitably I have some success. And I think too, like, I've talked about like developing your instincts as a hunter. And I was talking to Johnny Stewart about it. Like, him and I both, we really tap into that. Like, I really trust my gut and trust my instincts. And after doing this for, 25, almost 30 years, and kind of having that aggressive approach and learning to always go with my gut and follow my instincts, like they started to develop over time, and you find yourself making the right decision more often. Like, you get a gut feeling to hold up or to push further or to go this way or to, check this ridge or this drainage, or even when to move and when not to move, if you're like ground hunting or whatever. And you just start to tap into those instincts, and then you start to get real effective, make better decisions, and put yourself in the game more. So I think it's a combination of all of that. I think it's from growing up hunting in a hard state. I think guys that grew up hunting Iowa would have a hard time coming to the South, southern Michigan, and having success. There's a lot of guys, real big name guys, that lived in Michigan and didn't really kill anything that exceptional and moved to Iowa, and now they have a wall full of big bucks. And you don't see the opposite of that. You don't see a lot of these big state guys come to like a PA or an Alabama or a Michigan and do well. But it's a different world. It's a whole different skill set, and it's not taking anything away from those guys, because there's a learning curve there too. And a lot of those guys that are in Iowa, the top hunters, they might not be killing 4 or 5 year old deer. They're killing 6 and 7, or those big trophy bucks. So they got a whole good skill set themselves. But I think it's a combination of growing up in a tough place and having this kind of be my training ground, and then branching out to other states that have a little bit better opportunity, but also kind of favoring that more aggressive approach that creates more opportunities. I always tell guys, if you're too timid and you're too cautious, you're kind of on the outskirts looking in, right? You're playing it safe, and you're never really in there where you need to be because you're worried about spooking that deer, or I don't want to, I want to make this spot last all season, or I don't want to push the deer out and ruin my whole season. Well, I don't ever think like that. I'm always thinking about, I'm either trying to like gather information through scouting so that when I feel I have everything I need to feel confident in a spot or a sit, and then that's when I dive in, or I'm in there just scouting and kind of hunting as I go and really pushing in there. And if I bump into deer, it's not ideal, but it gave me information that I didn't have otherwise. And a lot of times that has led me to a good spot or chasing a new buck, because I'm in there kind of pushing the envelope. I spook a lot of deer. I do. I bump a lot of deer. I spook a lot of deer, but it's like I'm almost in their face so much, pushing in, I create more encounters for myself. So I'm always on good deer, like all throughout the season. There's certainly seasons that are tougher than others, and I've had them. But I think my style it creates more opportunities than, say, your average guy that might go in and sit a thicket or sit a funnel or something like that. And I do all that stuff too, but it has to be a very specific reason for me to do that. I need to know a buck's there. I need to know that the timing of the year, like this area heats up or whatever. And if I don't have that, if it's not that time, I'm in there and I'm pushing and I'm creating opportunities.
Oh, listen, we're going to do a full-length episode because I've got about 35 questions I would love to go through, but there's no time for it. One of the last things I want to do kind of with you to kind of wrap up, because there's a lot there that I think people are going to want to hear more about in an actual episode with you. But what do you think is one of the biggest mistakes that if a guy, say, like that Weekend Warrior's doing that's keeping him or holding him back from being successful, whether it's on his own private farm, whether he's hunting public land, whether he's hunting in leased land, whatever, or he's traveling to hunt. What do you think is holding him back potentially based off, again, some of the conversations you've had with guys that are trying to figure out how to become more successful and more efficiently successful?
Yeah, I don't know. The answer might be a little different depending on that guy's situation. So I'll tackle it from like an out-of-state perspective, like a weekend warrior that maybe he's traveling from Michigan down to Ohio. I think when you are a weekend warrior, when you are on a time crunch, you are forced to try to make things happen. If you want to be successful, you actually have to kind of force that encounter and that hunt, rather than where if you had 10 days to hunt, you might sit a couple observation sits, and you might sit back and wait and just kind of like maybe stage hunt your way in, depending on the situation. You might be a little more relaxed. You might be more apt to go back at noon and take a nap, eat lunch. But when you have 3 days, like I'm sending you to Illinois on this piece of public ground, on this permission piece, and I need you to kill a good buck in 3 days. It's like you are on a mission, and the number one thing is like you have to find that deer. You have to find that deer. So like from start to finish, you are on search mode and you are on aggressive mode, because half of that issue is just finding the deer, or finding that buck. So you have to kind of like, I think when you have these time constraints, it almost creates a style that a lot of guys don't need to have, because they have more time. They can play a more patient approach, a more sit back and wait for the perfect condition approach, where if you got a window, like South Dakota when I went last year, I had 3 days. I drove 19 hours to hunt 3 days. I have 3 days to get it done on a mule deer hunt. Like you're aggressive, and you are focused from daylight to dark, and you are in search mode, and you are like all your senses are tuned in, and you're at the top of the predator food chain, and that's kind of how you have to look at it when you're on that time crunch, and be more aggressive, because you just need that one opportunity. But if I were to like, wake up late, get out there late to the glassing knob, and glass for an hour, and then it's like, oh man, stretch and eat a little something, and you're taking a break, you're talking to your buddy. It's like, no, you have to stay focused every second, and you're glassing, you're looking for that one little glimpse, one antler, or a deer passing through a little shady pocket, where if you're not looking at that moment, you miss it. So it's more of those wall of time constraints force you to have a whole new style that is not reckless, but it's very aggressive and very direct and very focused. I can focus and do my best and be a real effective hunter for 3 or 4 days. You start giving me 9-10 days, I start getting worn out. Yeah, I'm maybe I don't want to get up early. I sleep till 9 one day, get out there a little late, or I come in one day for lunch. It's harder. But you do it for 2, 3, 4 days, like, yeah, you can stay like ultra laser focused, and you can get things done. But a lot of guys don't have the confidence to go to 19-hour drive to hunt 3 days. Like I've done that for 20 years, not 19 hours, but I drive 6 or 9 or 4, with 2 days to hunt, because the first few times I did that, I came back with a nice Pope and Young type buck. Like, I can do this. I can do this. Like, hunting in Michigan helped me, because it's a hard place to hunt, and now I'm going to easier places to hunt. And I can do this, and I can have fun, and I can kill nice deer. So I just started doing it. You only have 2 days to hunt Illinois. It's almost a $580 tag, and I would buy it and drive down and hunt 2 days, and I'd come back with something really nice. So you can do it, but you need some experience. You need to build up that experience. A new hunter trying to just boom, bounce and bomb to this state and this state, that's a tall order, because you're running into different types of terrain, different types of habitat, different challenges. But if you develop some skills, especially if you hunt in a tough area, you develop some skills, you probably have a good skill set. And if you're getting it done in those areas, you probably have the skill set to go just about anywhere and get on some nice deer. And you can't be afraid to just go and come home empty-handed. I don't care. If I go for a 3-day hunt and I come home empty-handed, I don't care. Nobody cares. Like I could say that on a podcast, and 15 minutes later, nobody remembers. So nobody cares. But it's more about building your skill set and just having the confidence to do it. And if you never put yourself in that situation, you don't know you don't know what you can do. And I think a lot of guys can probably do those types of things, and maybe they don't have that confidence. But it does. It takes a level of commitment. It takes years of experience, and it takes a laser focus when you're there. It's not hang out with buddy, drink beer time. It's like you're there on a mission. It's 3 days. You got 3 days to get it done. That's the way I look at it. But there's other guys that are way more relaxed. They want to go with their buddy and just have a good hunt and just have fun. If they shoot a deer, great. If they shoot a nice deer, even better. But it's like that's their fun, But when I go on those trips, more times than not, it's kind of that laser focus. Like I'm really trying to test myself and get something done. So I don't know. It's probably different for everybody, but that's kind of the way I look at it.
We've got so much to talk about, but we're going to have to save it for a full-length episode. Andy, thank you for joining us, and appreciate you coming to the expo, man.
Hey, thank you.
Absolutely.
Yep, appreciate it.
All right, guys, in the next segment, we got the man himself, Dan Infalt, joining us. Super excited here. And this is the first time Dan's ever been on the podcast, guys, so this is a great time. But, Dan, I got to ask you, like I'm asking everybody else, what has been one of the biggest factors for you for finding and targeting mature bucks in your area of the country?
The biggest factor for finding and getting on them is bedding, is finding their bedding areas. But I guess beyond that, I got to find the buck. There isn't a big buck on every property. So seeing them is a huge thing for me, because you never really have that, I know for sure thing until you get eyes on them or get a picture of them or something. And there's something about that, when I get eyes on them, it's like, okay, you're dead. This is it. You get that confidence feeling like, okay, now it's going to happen. And then I'll hunt down an area. But I spread myself out real thin over a large area. And, at first in the season, unless I'm onto something from over the summers, I'm just hitting a lot of target areas, looking for that sign, looking for those huge early rubs. And, and then once maybe I find those huge early rubs, then I start focusing on that area. There's something in here. Then I want to see it, get eyes on it. And I might still hop around and look other places, because I don't know if that's happening at night or what's going on. But once I get eyes on them, that's a huge factor.
Now, when you say eyes on, this is something that you kind of brought up a little bit in some of the Q&A and also your seminars with Mario, was not necessarily always using trail cameras. But when you put eyes on them, you're talking about doing observation sits typically?
Observation sits on foot, from a truck.
Okay.
However you got to do it. You look back and ripping apart my top 15 bucks, I think it's like 80 or 90% of them, I was hunting the buck I shot. And I had previous seen it. Probably, I think it's like 60 or 70% I hunted for multiple years before I shot him. So, there's just that confidence. He's in there. Now you can go in there and figure out there's only so many hiding spots. People are like, well, he doesn't move in daylight. No, they do. There's some place in there you're missing. There's something that you don't have. And if you have that mindset that it's like you're playing war, and they know you're coming, and they know you're after him, they're going to find, where isn't he going to look? I'm going to hide. And put yourself in his shoes. If I was out here and I was a deer, where would I hide on me? And I try to find that spot where nobody would look. Still has the features that a deer needs. Still has like an edge or a point or something, but it's in some obscure place where nobody'd look. I think the biggest thing with hunters is, even if you give them all the education, is they just want to believe it's the most remote. And I'm starting to find a lot of these public properties, you go back 2 miles, and that's where you find the most pressure. And at least the most, intelligent pressure. So you start seeing good hunters there who are in the right spots and stuff, and you start thinking, well, the buck that's making these rubs, or the buck I seen, or, if he was living here, he'd be dead. So where's the niche? And, and sometimes you find out that they're living on the private and coming to the public, and you ain't got a chance. You just got to move on. And you get a lot of guys that will just sit on that piece of public on the fence line waiting, and they'll never have a chance because they're putting too much scent there waiting. But they're probably not the only one waiting, and there's just no chance. And you just, cut ties with a deer you can't kill because you're wasting time. And, just keep moving until you get on one you can kill.
And one thing that you brought up multiple times, and if anybody listens to y'all's podcast, you and Josh's podcast before the Echo podcast, it always seems like overlooked spots always kind of comes up in conversation, and on the forum as well, overlooked spots. And that's something that we've taken into consideration a lot more in the Southeast where we're at, especially in Alabama and Arkansas, Tennessee, Georgia, and Mississippi where we hunt at. And a lot of those overlooked spots, kind of like you mentioned, by parking lots, but a lot of it's in areas that's like, at least what we found is there's no parking spots, but it's 100 yards off the road.
Yeah.
And it's like everybody, I was talking to Dieter Kochan earlier about this, is that's why he likes using an e-bike, because he's like, you can't park anywhere. Like, there's no shoulder of the road. You can't park in the road. But if you can park down the road, come back and go 100 yards into the woods, you might find that pocket that everybody's walking past and nobody's stopping right there. And it's funny because down where we're at, our public land's so roaded up, a lot of it. There's some of it's a little more remote, but if you do that whole, I'm going to walk a mile and a half in, 2 miles, you're walking yourself into another road.
Right.
So it's like, it kind of bites you in the butt, and we used to do that, try to walk as far as possible. Next thing you know, you walk up on somebody else who's out there hunting that came in from a different area, and you just walk yourself back into pressure versus finding those spots that are literally 50 to 100 yards off the road, and that's where we've seen some of the biggest and best bucks in Alabama. And especially like habitat-wise, it's so different from like where you're at, say in Wisconsin, compared down south. We just deal with so many pine trees, and there's not a whole bunch of hardwoods except in your stream side management zones, your creeks. But those pines that are at an age where guys can't really get a tree stand in them, that, maybe they're 8, 10 years old. If you get a tree stand, you're 6 foot up, but you can't see anything. You're looking like pretty much underneath the stand. If you sit on the ground, it's fairly open, but that's where all the bucks want to cruise through, and a lot of times it's right next to those roads. And I've got a spot this year. I'm going to try to implement a little bit more of that and try to kill one where there's a big community scrape right there about 100 yards off the road that these bucks are paralleling. But with overlooked spots, we had a guy ask you this yesterday about overlooked spots, and you made the point of, all these guys everybody's, it seems like if you're in this niche of mobile hunting, it seems like everybody's doing this. But if you look at, it's like a fraction of the hunters actually out there. Probably 95% of the guys aren't doing what's being talked about at these shows and what you talk about. It just seems like it when you're in those groups and you're on the forums and stuff, and it seems like everybody's doing that. That taking into consideration, especially when it comes to like overlooked spots and trying to get visuals on the deer, is it sometimes just not complicating as much as in, if there's thick cover or some kind of obstruction close to an access point that guys are trying to walk around and go past it, that could be a likely spot you could find a mature buck in those areas.
If it's got cover that could hold a buck, I'm going to go look at it. And I'm going to specifically go look at overlooked spots where I think when we talk about this, people think, well, I'll keep that in mind that they could be there. And they still go to the remote spots and stuff like that. And I just don't want to compete with people. I'll take that whole public land and I'll cross 99% of it off, and I'll be just looking at these little patches where I think people don't go. And those are going to be the first places I go. And if I end up in one of those remote places, it's because of what I saw. So I'm right away going to those overlooked spots.
Yeah. And another thing, I don't know if you've dealt with this, and especially more roaded areas, one of our buddies taught us this, is like when you have a Y in an intersection of a road and there's no parking areas, the center of that Y, because everybody, when they come to a turn or they come to a Y in an intersection, they think they're going to keep driving a little bit further in. But like that Y of the intersection is the places that we've had success as well, finding a spot where bucks living close to the road, but there's thick cover there. He can get away from that pressure, and nobody wants to get in between that 200-yard gap between the two roadways, and he'll move, just after dark or throughout the day in that little hub. And when we've looked at GPS data from the Southeast, specifically in Alabama, that we get our hands on, we kept seeing that over and over again, how close these bucks, especially the mature bucks that were collared, were bedded within 100 yards of the road, which is fascinating. It's one thing when you personally see it. It's another thing when you see the GPS data of, 60 bucks, and you're like, nearly all these deer are within, earshot of these roads within 100, 150 yards.
Yeah.
So
think about this. You get into these solid pine patches and even if it's hardwood or whatever, and it gets a little mature and has understory. Only where the sun breaks through, if there's a hole, a tree fell down or something, is there any kind of, real good green, good food. And deer don't just eat cornfields. They don't just eat acorns and stuff. They eat vast varieties of plants we couldn't even name, Any place where there's a lot of green, right? A little bit of sun hitting. Where does that happen? In those big forests. Right along the road where the sunlight hits the edges. They do a lot of feeding right alongside roads. And then they got cover there, too, from that same plant life to live. And then they got a barrier. They got to have that edge. Because what a mature whitetail needs is an escape. So he needs to, monitor one way, have an escape the other, and if it's something comes from that way, he still has an escape the monitor way, right?
Absolutely.
So they will take and they'll use the road, they'll use the thick cover, they'll use the opening seeing into that hardwoods, and they'll use the wind, and they'll use the thermals, and they'll find some spot along that road where nobody goes because it's not near a parking lot. It's not near a parking spot. A lot of times you'll see a canal along those roads, right? Right on the other side of that canal. I mean, you literally got to walk half a mile to get over, just as much as those guys that are going to the middle, competing for those spots. You got to go way around to get at him. Then you got to get out around from away with the angle, with the wind and stuff. It ain't easy. It's not like we're not walking the distance or doing the work, but we're hunting where the deer are, regardless of whether it looks stupid or not. It's the whole dating a fat chick theory. You know, for those that didn't hear that, it's fat chicks are fun. They're not stuck up, and they're just happy to be around you. You know, but you don't want your friends to see you there, right? Well, you get in this tree, you're like, I sure hope nobody sees me here. I feel embarrassed hunting here. But those are the type of spots I shoot my biggest bucks.
Oh, yeah, and like you said, just like the whole fat girl analogy, a lot of people are like, they almost feel embarrassed when they find that sign and they bump a buck. Or how often do you hear from guys that they hike back to their truck after going super far and they bump a buck 60 yards from their truck?
Right.
It happened last year. I sat at an overlooked spot, intentionally watching the parking area. Now, this is on a firearm hunt next to a big clear cut that's about 2.5 years old. A lot of broom sedge grass growing up. Pines are about 2.5, 3 feet tall. And you'd always see, it was on a gated road, and when you walked in, you'd always find big buck tracks crossing right there. I mean, 60 yards from the truck. So I'm like, I'm going to get 200 yards from the truck where I can see all the way back to the truck and just watch that area. And all my buddies, we put 4 trucks at the gate. All my buddies walked 3/4 of a mile in. I sat that morning, saw 2 bucks, passed 2 bucks, had a really nice 8-point come from the truck. I have no idea where he came from, but next thing I know, he's 60 yards from me walking right towards me, nice 8-point. Filmed him, sent him to the buddies, and they're all like, man, why don't I hear gunshots? I'm like, well, we know there's bigger deer here. Let's try to figure out if one of these bigger bucks come through, and they never did that day. But when my buddies walked back to their truck, I could watch them, and they could see me up in my stand, and against one of those goofy spots, it said dating the fat girl. And when they got to their truck, there was a strip of pines, not 15 yards wide, about 30 yards long, next to the trucks they're parked to. When they started their truck up and started talking, a buck got up out that tree line, 40 yards from him, and slipped over onto some private land and got out. And I'd text him, hey, you just had a buck right behind you. Y'all never knew it. And he's like, really? I'm like, yeah, I'm filming him and filming you at your truck as he's walking away. Again, it wasn't a shooter, but it shows you how well they're accustomed to, like, if people are walking in, if they can hold tight and they're comfortable kind of sitting low and you don't make eye contact or bump them, it almost seems like in those areas, even if they smell you, they're like, after, I guess, just the conditioning, they're used to people not walking in there. They may smell you, but I'm just going to hold tight, and then once you get out, then they're going to ease off.
Even if sometimes they don't even ease off. They just get so used to it. I find a lot of spots where there's really good buck beds just watching a parking lot or watching an axis. And one of the very biggest bucks that I ever shot with a bow, field dressed, it bottomed out a 300-pound scale. And they're bigger up north, right? But
oh God, I can't comprehend that, but okay.
Yeah, it was just unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like that big dude at school. You're like, how is that even possible?
Yeah.
Remember that guy?
Yeah, 6'5", about 340. Yeah.
Right. But that buck, I was watching him right next to a parking lot, and it's the main parking lot, like one of the 2 main parking lots of this big public area. And it has a main axis that goes out like a mile. It's got like this logging road that goes out like a mile, and then it spreads out, right? And everybody just follows that logging road, And then there's some private land along the, edges, and it goes out like kind of like it's an axis easement for hunters to get back there. But it's wide enough you could hunt it. Like it's, maybe the easement's 100 yards across. So you get in there, you're kind of close to the border, but I'm watching this buck get up on the private land right alongside the road, right alongside the parking lot, and come out and stage by the parking lot and literally sometimes walk right through the parking lot between the cars and across the road. And nobody's at the parking lot at gray light. So there was 2 bucks. There was a 140 class 10-pointer and this one. And they're both coming out of that bedding, staging at one spot, making a scrape there, like competing against each other. And when I got everything right, I went in there and shot that thing. And literally, the whole parking lot was full of cars, and minutes before shooting it, people came out of their cars and walked up the access pass 50 yards from me. I mean, you shoot those things right underneath people. People think that those deer got to be, like, are afraid of people or way back. Where they don't like scent is in their bedding area. They are like, they're okay with it being on the access route. That they're used to that. They're used to people occasionally walk around the cornfield or across the acorn flat or whatever, and they'll still move there kind of sometimes, you know. But, you know, I'll get a lot of people that'll tell me that, every place I show up in my woods, I run into a tree stand. You know, it's the right spot. It's got the point. It's going into the bedding, blah, 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 but there's a tree stand there and there's somebody hunting there. Would you still hunt there if they're not there? And I have to tell them that, you could probably still kill a good deer there. But when I look at my stats, all my top 15 bucks that were all over 5 years old, every one of them was shot in a spot where there was no sign of any hunter before. The majority of them was the very first time I hunted there. So, you know, those bucks figure you out. That literally, if you look at how many hunters are out there, look at rut, how many hunters are out there? If they got up and chased does around, they'd be dead. They wouldn't make it to 6 years old. So if they're 6 years old, they're an incredible survival machine. And you got to look at that like, where would you go if you're an incredible survival machine? If you were the smartest buck out there, how would you survive? And you don't think about how to hunt, I need scrapes, I need rub lines. Just put all that out the window. Think about where would he hide and find that. And then find his sign there, go in and kill him.
I've got so much I want to talk to you about, but we got to do a full-length episode. Hopefully, we've talked behind the scenes a little bit. Hopefully, maybe you can come hunt Alabama this year, you and Josh. That would be kind of interesting.
I would like to hunt Alabama.
Because I would love to see how everything from like Wisconsin and kind of upper Midwest that you've hunted, how that translates down south and the similarities and maybe differences between it, and do an episode after that kind of comparing the two. Because I think a lot of Southern, we have a lot of listeners that like some guys may know about you, some guys probably don't know about you, just the area of the country that we're in. But the guys that know about you, some of those guys try to apply some of the bedding tactics down south, and some areas it works. Like we found 2 huge beds, I don't know, about a week and a half ago scouting and pushing through some real thick stuff right away from 100, where another guy, actually one of our podcast guests, had a trail camera 150 yards away that we didn't know was his trail camera when we walked past it. And these 2 big bucks that he had on camera last year that are upper echelon kind of deer, you know, in that 140, 150 range, are bedded 150 yards from there in a spot that I don't think he's pushed into before. Another little hardwood SMZ little ditch that runs up in a clear cut, and they're bedded right there with a ton of overhang, canopy cover, and there's 5 white oaks right there that's going to be dropping this year. We just checked them. And it's like you can find beds in the South, but I want to see, especially if y'all come down and trying to focus on some of that bedding during that rut time period, what y'all could get into, and especially trying to see, you know, with the average hunter out there, what they're doing, trying to hunt all those pinch points, which can work. But if they were running around like you're saying they are, or like some people think they are, all of them would be killed. And as thick as our cover is down there, there's a reason why they survived to get some serious age on those deer.
And if you got mature bucks running around on there and they're running around like people think they're in the rut, everybody that sits those funnels would have walls like mine, right?
Absolutely, and that's a good point. So I'll say this again. We could talk for a whole bunch longer, but I know we got more people coming to the show, so we got here real early. But I appreciate you, Dan, for joining us, and again, hope to see you down in Alabama this year.
Yeah,
awesome. Appreciate it. Thank you, sir. All right, guys, we got on the next segment Garrett Prahl from the DIY Sportsman on YouTube, good buddy of ours. And Garrett, first of all, it's good to see you again, and thank you for coming out to the expo, man. This has been a great time so far.
Yeah, definitely.
I've got to ask, and I'm asking everybody the same question: what's been one of the biggest factors for you when it comes to like consistently finding mature bucks and getting on mature bucks, like in your area of the country?
Yeah, for me, it's been, spreading out a wide enough net to find them, because sometimes you get those smaller public pieces and they could have good deer on them, or they could not, or maybe they start the season with them and then they move off, and it's like you're playing that game trying to time everything right and getting to pull off the private and whatever. And it's usually easier, I found, to go to the bigger pieces where you know that you're gonna find deer that spend pretty much their entire lives on that public, and you still got to find them, and it sometimes can still be more work and more boot miles to explore all that land. But if I run enough cameras in the best spots, and maybe not pepper a place with cameras, but maybe over a year learn how the deer behave in a certain area and say, okay, well, if I put one camera here, I can get 90% of the intel I would have got with all those other cameras, and then do that again and again and again, and just over several years build that library, then that becomes a little bit easier for me to spread a wide net and say, like, okay, now it's easier for me to figure out which locations maybe this year are going to have big ones, and maybe in that case also you have some historical data to say, like, oh yeah, this buck was really active here like 2 years ago, 1 year ago, And then that for me has been a lot easier than just trying to figure it out on one given piece of land every year.
Oh, dude, you're getting me excited, especially about annual patterns and historical patterns and all that stuff. You mentioned one thing that I really want to dive into. You talk about using trail cameras, and instead of spraying them out everywhere, you could fine-tune them to get like 90% of the data you'd get from multiple cameras in one camera location.
Mm-hmm.
What does it take to find that camera location, and what are you looking for to get that kind of data from one camera source?
Yeah, so initially, if I don't know what's going to be the best, I will put out more cameras. And then maybe in a scenario like that, I look at all the data at the end of the year, and it's like, well, clearly this one had the most activity and had the most individual bucks that hit it. So that's the one that I'm going to use in the future for inventory purposes. And let's, say an example like a beaver swamp area where I go and scout and I find a bunch of places that could be really good pinch points, good scrapes, good rub lines. But then it seems like if I can find the best scrape, that's usually where I'm going to get the most amount of buck activity and the most pictures of individual deer. I had one that I had found, it got logged since, so it's not quite the same as what it used to be. Mm-hmm. But I had a camera over a scrape right on the edge of water, and it had good doe bedding kind of on a hillside leading down to it, just set up perfect. And between, I think I put it out on October 16th, and from October 17th through like November 8th, 10th, 12th, something around there wasn't more than one day that had gone by throughout that entire stretch where there wasn't at least one daylight buck, at least 2.5 or older on it.
I'm just, one reason I'm smiling over here, Kim probably saw me. If Andrew's here, he'd want to go super in-depth on this whole straight thought. We probably actually, I've said this to a couple of guests we've had on so far, I might have to do a full-length episode with you on this kind of subject. Because I'm trying to think, I've interviewed you for Turkey. Have we ever done a full-length deer episode with you? Okay, nope. Well, maybe we got to do that. Okay, you're talking about like the best scrape. In your areas, what kind of features are you looking for the best scrape, as in location to the scrape, from, I guess, pinch points, travel corridors, bedding areas, looking branches? Like, give us like maybe there's like an example that comes to mind of like one of the better scrapes you found, and give us an example of like what did that actually look like and what made it so good.
Yeah, so usually the best scrapes seem to be around areas of doe bedding. Thicker cover, a lot of edge, a lot of diversity. Maybe you got multiple pockets of does, and then you have travel corridors amongst them. And in those areas, I'll find these scrapes, and you got good historical sign. Like I found one, a month ago in a place like this where you just found the licking branch, and the scrape wasn't pawed out, but it's like you're walking through this thick area on the, a doe trail basically, and then it opens up in this little pocket, and it's like, oh, there should be a scrape here where, okay, there's the licking branch. You go find it's like, the size of your thumb. It's sticking down. It's all shredded from years past. And when you look at those places on the map after you find it, and you think contextually, like, oh yeah, there's doe bedding here, 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 and a buck could also cruise downwind on this, swamp that's, 100 yards downwind, and he could scent check that scrape too if he wanted to, or come right up into it and actually hit it. And so that seems to be a commonality, is that it's usually dense cover. The deer won't have to go far to get into a really secure location. A lot of times you can be 40 yards off the scrape and be hidden, right? And you have a lot of doe activity just generally around. Those seem to be the types of scrapes that towards the later half of October will start to get really good, and we'll have multiple different bucks hitting them. That might not be the best place to kill. It just depends on the overall scenario. But in terms of at least finding good inventory places, those seem to be the ones.
A lot of those scrapes come to mind. Some of the ones that we find. Andrew's a scrape fanatic. And has an eye for licking branches. Typically, I'm looking for timber rattlesnakes where we're at, when we're walking around. So I got my head, I'm looking up, but I'm looking down too as we're going through. And he's just like, I'll get snake bit. And he's like, oh, here's a licking branch, here's a licking branch. We actually scouted a spot 2 weeks ago that we talked about on a previous episode, that the second we hit this hardwood drainage, it's got pines and like different age clear cuts all around it, and you hit this creek bottom, and it's all big wad oaks and poplars and stuff down there. And we start walking. He said, man, look at this licking branch. Man, look at that. And like you could barely see the ground. Like some of them were like, I don't know how much activity they had last year, but some smaller licking branches. And then you find one that's like, for sure this is a community scrape. You could look at like the old pawings, and again, they haven't pawed it in forever, but you can see how much the ground had been worked and how deep it was dug out. Then you'd have 2 or 3 of those huge licking branches, again, the size of your thumb, again, for listeners and viewers on YouTube. Got us pretty excited. And then we come to find out, we walked another 60 yards, and we didn't know this at the time, but we found a trail camera, and we didn't know who it was. I'm like, man, it's kind of early for our guys to put trail cameras out. Most guys in Alabama are putting trail cameras out the first week of July, and we go past it and come to find out it was one of our buddies, Scott Seals, who's killed a lot of big deer in the same area, a lot of big deer in Alabama. He's been on podcast a few times. Comes out, that was his trail camera. We were on it, and we went further in, and I was just telling Dan this. We went further in, pushed up another hardwood drainage because this is hill country. Again, clear cuts on top, like, 5-6-year-old pines on top, and then these hardwood drainages. And this smaller hardwood drainage kind of stopped out in the clear cut after probably 250 yards and kind of went past the camera. Had to push through some super thick, nasty stuff that was just miserable, but found 2 giant beds there. I mean, the size of this table, even not bigger, back in there. And we talked to Scott, and he's like, "Oh, yeah, that same area," because we were sharing information after we found out it was his camera. He's like, "Oh, I had 2 really big deer in there last year that were like using that area early season." I'm like, "Well, I think we found where they bed at." I don't know how we're going to kill them there, if you could kill them there, because it's so thick and hard to get into, but now you know. But again, it was like all those scrapes, like there wasn't a scrape where those beds are at. They're all further down, like with all the thermals falling down to that creek. They were all down there by that big creek. Yeah. And like that's where all the sign was at. And then you kind of got back up in here, and other than like browse pressure, you can see like the browse throughout the whole spring and summertime. There was no rubs, there was no scrapes, and probably just early season bedding and kind of summer bedding in this location. But it was just kind of fascinating how they were just off the does. The does are a little bit further up from where the bucks were bedded at, because we walked by a ton of doe bedding. They were in bigger pines and, kind of a little more open area compared to where the bucks were at, and kind of put all the pieces together. I'm like, okay, that's a pretty interesting spot. But with the scrapes, do you ever see – we talked about like historical data or annual patterns in some of these areas. Do you ever see with your trail cameras like a specific buck, if you have multiple years of history with them, hitting a similar scrape, or just bucks hitting a specific scrape at a very specific window of time in the season?
Yeah, like it seems like frequently you'll have an area that just lights up for like 3 days, where it's like maybe you have generally good activity once it starts to get toward, like in my area, later October, and even sometimes into early November. Sometimes I'll still hit a scrape on like November 10th. But definitely that peak seems to be around like that end of October time frame. And what you might find is maybe it's the same buck, maybe it's a group of bucks, but it can be hard to predict micro, meaning like what direction are they going to come from when they do hit it, what time of day, like that varies a lot. But that general window seems to be really close. And the only thing that I've seen really mess that up year over year is when pressure comes in. I had a place where I had historical data from like 3 years where it's just like a money spot, like 26th to 28th, like I got to be here. And I went and sat it, and I had a good weather. And I'm like, man, I'm just not seeing what I would expect to see based on what these deer have done the last 3 years. Like, what changed? And I'm in my tree, and I look over, and I see a cell camera sitting over there. I'm like, oh, well, that's new. And I got around and scouted a little bit, and then I found another tree stand, and like there's clearly like people, for all I know, had been hunting there early part of the season throughout, and so that I kind of marked off on the list and tried to just go back to some of the other spots that I had found.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating, like what you're mentioning. It's like if you find some of these spots that's not really getting pressure, it's kind of like it's going to be similar year over year. The second excess pressure comes in, and maybe it's not like just a guy hunting it once, but he's hunting it multiple times, or multiple guys are hunting it multiple times. It then kind of will shift that movement. Maybe, who knows in your area, but we've seen it like shifts movement 200 yards, or maybe it might be 400 yards from that area to the next best cover type, next best edges and everything. And like they just start using that, and they'll probably still be on that guy's camera at night,
right?
Or maybe super early in the morning, but they're not spending a whole bunch of time there moving during legal hunting hours,
right?
Also, another thing with annual patterns, have you learned anything? Like, has there been anything of note that you've used, like, kind of taken away from like an annual pattern with that trail camera data that's directly affected you when it comes to like whether it's hunting a specific deer or a very specific spot that you've had like success with?
I've noticed that if I can correlate a certain wind with daylight activity, then I can wait for that specific wind direction. Like some of those little 3-day windows, I think some of the reason that specific 3 days is right is because of the context around it. Like certainly the does that are coming into heat, that's going to happen around the same time every year. But maybe that daylight activity shifts to like the 25th through the 27th in the next year just because of how the weather patterns come in or the wind direction, where it makes sense for them to scent check via that area. And so that I will pay attention to, where, if it lights up and it was like right when the wind switched from like south to like a northwest, okay, now I know that area, these 3 dates, whenever I have that, if it shifts a couple days one way or the other, like that's when I would go in there, because that's when it probably makes sense. I wouldn't want to necessarily get in and put my scent in that area before I had the right wind to where the deer were going to really start using it in daylight.
Awesome. Garrett, let me tell you this. I forgot to ask the other guys this, but I want to start asking you and some of these other guests I'm going to have on. What would be like one of your biggest pieces of advice for guys going to this season who haven't had the consistent success, even finding and locating mature bucks, let alone trying to kill one, but that's their goal. It's like, I want to try to get to be able to kill or find a mature buck. What would you tell them to maybe start focusing on for this season to maybe help them get, lined out in the straight direction?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough being this close, at least when you think about rut hunting. It's tough now because the best time to scout for rut is either during the rut, like live, or postseason when all that rut sign's really visible. This time of year it can be really hard unless you know exactly what you're looking for. Like I can go into a spot and be like, I'm looking for that one licking branch. And if I find it, it's like, yes, like now I know, like I can come back here in October and really start to put some more time in and scout it then once the foliage is kind of down. But if you don't have that, it can be tough. And it's like, yeah, we talk about locating through scrapes on, ag fields if you've got ags in the area or glassing or things of that nature. But a lot of places I hunt don't really set up great for getting that kind of intel, which is why I happen to rely on the trail cameras as much as I do in that type of scenario. But I would say it definitely never hurts to just continue to scout. Scout more than you hunt, like Dan would always say. And don't get tied too much up into an area. Don't feel afraid to spread yourself out if you're not seeing what you think you want to see. Last September, I'd hunted an area where trail cameras weren't allowed, and it was like, as soon as I see the good sign, I'm going to set up. And I went like 4 hunts in a row where I just kept checking spots and ended up right back at the truck, and I never set up because I didn't really find what I thought was going to be good enough to set up on, just never that hot, fresh sign. And then eventually I found it, and I was like, ended up being like 60 yards from the beds, and you could hear them get it right at last light, and it was like they just couldn't make that last little 60 yards in enough time. But that was more weather-based.
What kind of sign was that, by the way, that you found that you're like, okay, this is it, after not seeing that sign the whole time?
So that was a September hunt, so it was isolated white oaks that were falling, mixed with, like, really fresh droppings.
Okay.
Yeah. Because a lot of times you'll find oak trees out there, and you get into that area, and it's like, okay, there's an oak, but maybe it's not dropping right now, or maybe it is, if, like, there's acorns everywhere. But it's like if you find one of those oak trees that's getting hit right now, it's like there's usually a lot of droppings around, and you might find a really fresh rub, even if it's early September. So that's usually the kind of sign that I would say, like, okay, this is probably worth setting up on.
And was that Minnesota?
Yeah.
So Southerners out there, listen, even though he's from Minnesota, he's still hunting features. All you boys in Arkansas, talking about like, oh man, that's their tactic in Arkansas and a bunch of other states. Yeah, you can still do it in everywhere in the country where you can find the sign. Also, there's so many other questions. We're going to have to do a full-length episode because I don't want to take up a ton of your time here at the expo, but Garrett, appreciate you coming by. Appreciate you doing the podcast. And, yeah, we're going to have to line up to do a full-length episode because I think we can go extremely deep into the weeds of a lot of things. So, awesome.
Yeah,
appreciate it, brother.
Absolutely.
All right, guys, next on the segment, we have Johnny Stewart from Pennsylvania on here, man. How you doing, brother?
Good, Jake. I'm doing well, buddy.
Dude,
Thanks.
It finally got you in person, man. Listen, had you on the podcast before. I'm like, this is going to be fun. Unfortunately, our buddy Bo Martonic can't be here from the East Meets West podcast. I'm going to give him some crap after this. But, it is what it is. I've got to get into this, Johnny, with you. Real quickly, right off the bat, you're one of these guys that's always been, especially in the last few years, but really for a while, been consistently targeting mature bucks. You've had a lot of success doing so in a bunch of states that you hunt. What's been one of the biggest factors for that? Again, staying consistent when targeting mature bucks in your area of the country.
So I think just anywhere I travel and hunt, I'm always actually see where the pressure is, deer hunting pressure, and use that to my advantage. You know what I mean? So, and also find what the deer are going to want, habitat and food and whatever. But look at e-scout and find like their ideal habitat. And now with all the info out there in hunting, and there's a lot of good hunters, kind of see where you would go, and that's probably where most of the hunters are going to want to go to. So lately, and I think it evolves, hunting, this public land, people are knowing more about these deer. You just got to stay ahead of it. So it might be the most ideal area on your e-scouting for deer to be, but that is also true for the people that go in there hunting. So lately, I've been just kind of using like a nucleus is where the deer would be, and also probably the hunters, and just working outwards. A lot of these deer, mature deer on this public lands, nocturnal. So at some place, they're going to be in a safe area. So I've been looking. I kind of try to dumb it down all my years and all the knowledge, and you can get into rabbit holes talking scrapes, rubs, this and that. Like where is the safe area that you think these mature deer are going to be and get away? It might be an area without rubs, without any sign, but it's just a safe area. So I think pressure's a huge thing. Hunting pressure is a huge thing that I'm looking for, but I use it to my advantage. A lot of my buddies are like, too many guys there. I said, okay. I said, I'd say 90-some% of the mature deer know that this guy's in here. He's accessing wrong or just leaving scent, or if he's a 6-8-year-old animal, this has been done before, and he can associate that and live by association and find associate areas with nobody in them. So lately, with the hype of public hunting and that's dumbing it down, just finding what I call safe areas. Like I look for a safe area because, you're hunting October to November, and these deer, this is when they're packing on the pounds, right? Like, well, not November, but October. And these deer are somewhere feeding. They're getting up and feeding and moving around. And these deer are living year to year, and, everybody's hunting acorns or whatever it might be. I call it like, another analogy I use analogies a lot, is like you take a photographer and takes a picture, and you don't just have the subject in the middle. You have a few things that are attractive to you. So, like, I look at e-scouting, and you have a lot going on in one area, and that's almost like that picture. It's not just the subject right in the middle. It's attractive to your eye, and it has all these things happening. So that's where the deer, like, are going to want to go to. But like I said, work out from there, find these safe areas that might not have anything. But yeah, pressure's a huge thing. I mean, we can go on about it. I mean, anymore I don't really, all the scrape knowledge and that, and people go down them rabbit hole. And I just can't. I just looking for safe areas that these deer are going to be in, So
I want to hit on this because you brought up one of the best points I've heard so far on this podcast, which is if you look at it on the map and it automatically grabs your attention, anybody out there with a similar skill set or skill level that knows how to read aerial maps is also going to be drawn into that same area. And that's something we've talked about in the podcast, and I've personally seen that where, like, you find something that looks like the second you pull that piece of public land, or whether you're on a private farm, whatever, or especially public land because you got a lot of other hunters out there, if it automatically grabs your attention, like, right off the bat, you're typically going to go find hunting. So you're going to find some kind of hunting pressure. If you're looking for like those super obvious, transition edges, especially if you're looking at a topo map with habitat edges, it's like
diversity in that area.
You're going to find a lot of other guys, if they're successful and where they listen to some of these podcasts or watch the YouTube videos and everything, you're going to find pressure there. And it's like almost like, okay, where's that next best place that like. It takes me a little bit longer to find it on the maps, but when I see it, I'm like, okay, this would make sense. If a lot of guys are going right here in this, say, the center of this property where it looks super good, you have all these habitat edges, all the diversities in this one spot, what's like on the outer edge of that maybe isn't from like an access point or something like that, but again, probably could hold some deer, especially if that's getting pressure right there in the center where all that diversity is at.
I go downwind, start there. He's going to come into that area, like maybe take, for example, a clear cut that gets pressured. And then you want to go into these areas, the area that you're attracted to that has the diversity. You want to go into these areas yearly because I've found where hunters move in and hunt it and it's bad. Then they'll move out, and then these mature deer, a mature deer will start using that area. The longer he goes without getting pressured, he's going to ease up on, his, let his guard down to some degree and maybe start using that. So you want to go in and check that ideal area yearly, because there's years I moved out and I told my buddies, that's run over with guys and they've been in there. So they moved in there, my buddies, and hunted and had success, bucks everywhere. And I'm like, yep. So I learned that happens, because these deer are definitely coming in downwind, maybe after dark or right on the gray light, using that, using the wind to scent check or after dark. And then if guys aren't in there, like my buddies moved in and hunted area and they had success, then the following year my buddies like, I'm hunting here again. Guys were coming in on e-bikes and that, and it just went out the window again. But downwind, and I talk about just like seams, like maybe where two properties meet. Or I found this year where a buck in the winter I tracked along a highway for almost 3/4 of a mile, and he could hear the roar of the highway, no parking spots, and he had that cushion of 100 yards from the highway. He paralleled it, and on the north side, guys would come in on logging roads, and it was almost like this. There was what I call a seam where he felt safe traveling. There was not much sign of deer, but you find like where maybe two properties meet, or like a fence, something, that he can travel and that's a safe area. Or like I said, some of these areas I hunt in PA are pretty vast, to where I talk about these safe areas. It could be 50 acres, just an area. And I talked about October, maybe hunting these areas. There's got to be some type of vegetation, food. They're going to get up and move. But they're going to do it with their guard down a little bit because they don't really see people in those areas. They're on high alert when they get into. And now you'll see a lot of sign maybe in these places that are attractive to you, but chances are it's the yearlings, the does, and the younger bucks. You'll see the rubs, but chances are it's at night. But then you run into the situation, like I said, if the guys are out not hunting that area, he could be in there, but he's always, on guard in them areas, and it's tough to hunt, like I said, find these sometimes just out of a way place. You might have water, some type of food, even browse. They might get their acorns and their mast in them areas at night, but during the day he'll just browse and move. So it's just kind of like just keep working your way out from that nucleus and drop cameras and just be aware of the pressure and stuff.
Let me ask you this. Talk about these safe areas, especially if we're taking maybe like some of the places in PA, which to me is kind of a little more relevant to like some of the areas in the southeast, is in rugged areas, a lot of logging activity, really no ag in some of these areas. In areas with a lot of logging, and you have different age clear cuts or cutovers at different stages of growth. At any point do those clear cuts become one of those safe areas, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it can when you have some, especially if the pressure's low. But even that, if they have I like cuts that are kind of like a 3 to 4, but have clumps of trees. If they feel secure and if they feel like they're bumped and they can navigate, if it's a big enough piece of clear cut, there's definitely a chance. I think they would use it. But then again, it might be an area where the normal or the deer, like the does and the yearlings, most of the herd, like younger deer, are going to use, and he's just not going to want to be there, But I definitely, if the pressure's not too high, I could see them using that, But I feel like they're so smart, these mature deer, they don't need to be in that jungle. Like they don't want to navigate them trails. They're going to use these seams. I've seen it where two properties meet near a road, like an old homestead that has a little bit of a different habitat, more open, but maybe a vantage point, maybe it's up high, or he can hear the road, people parking, wind, and he'll live there rather than be in that jungle. You know what I mean? Not saying if you look at a radio collar deer, he's like this. He does move, but so I'm not saying he can't be in there, but he don't need to live in that. He's going to find an easier, he has a big rack and stuff like that. He don't want to walk through that jungle. He's going to find somewhere easier, smart to and be aware of where know where the hunting pressure is going to come. Like I feel like analogy I use is if you were in your house and someone was stalking you or wanting to kill you, and you're going to look out your windows and see someone pulling in your driveway. You're not going to be hiding in your closet, hiding. You want to know where danger's coming from and be ready for that. So I feel like these bucks are in these areas, and we talk a lot anymore about hunting near parking spots. And a lot of times when you just change the speed of your vehicle, going down the road, slam the door, this and that, chances are you already maybe ruined your hunt, So I think these bucks definitely will get in there and hunt. Live in them cuts, especially he'll cross paths with them yearlings and does, but he'd rather be alone, maybe on this edge of the cut. He would definitely be in there, but I would look for the more open areas that has some browse and stuff for he could know where pressure's coming from and be ready.
So what's another maybe example of some safe areas that you found maybe in PA is like habitat edges? Like I'm guessing, especially in some of these areas, just talk about with maybe some of these clear cuts, just because it's super relatable to the southeast. What would be like a typical safe area? Like if most of the average guys can be drawn to that hard edge of that clear cut, especially if it's the newer clear cut, what's kind of like something that would kind of draw your attention off that and try to find a safe area that these mature bucks are going to be using off those cuts?
So I think anything different out of the norm of the normal habitat. We were in Alabama last year, and I found a safe, right near the road. There was like an old homestead, some big trees. There was just something like if you spend so much time in the woods and you're in these cuts, and I feel like a lot of people have plots and corn, and this is the norm. This is what, for a mature deer to live in that situation, he's going to get killed and live with that. He's going to, just something other. It could be just an old fence road right near the road. They're like the scene. Maybe it's a power line that parallels the road, and then you go back in the forest, or they got the cuts and that. He might be laying right on the edge, and just something. Don't look for a lot of sign. Beds more, maybe shit, but not so much rubs and like I find mature deer, like a lot of times anymore, I don't even want to see a deer trail if I'm hunting a mature deer. These trails that these does live on. Not saying he's going to crisscross them, but just cover diversity in a small area where he can browse during the day. Just stuff look like for something different happening than the norm. The food plots, the edges, the cuts. Maybe it's just a little piece of open woods with just a little bit of brush, near a road, near a park, near someone's house. Maybe a little high elevated area that just has some, briars or some, but not with the general like herd, the deer herd, the does, the fawns. You know
They're
what I'm
gonna be
saying?
slightly separated.
Separated, I feel, in just something a little bit different, but smaller amounts of diversity in where you can browse and stuff like that. But just look for not the norm, where you're going in and you see the normal deer acting and running trails and cuts, and I just feel like that's what you're going to see is the normal deer population, not the small percentage. You know what I mean?
How do you see big bucks or mature bucks using more steeper terrain for bedding and traveling compared to like more gentle rolling hills? Like if you have like some of that steeper terrain in areas, do you ever see for some reason some bucks tend to like lean towards that a little bit more so?
Yeah, I think if it's like rugged areas, less accessible areas, and I tell people how a lot of people don't like to go down on a steep hillside and hunt. Like a deer, I tracked deer enough in the snow, and just in general, you see their toes, their hoofs are only maybe that far apart. So they're almost walking so if they're walking on a hillside, traversing a hillside, for me and you, it's tough to walk on a hillside, but they use a topo line. It's almost like them walking on a flat piece of ground. They'll travel a topo line, easily, and that's not, people look down. I used to look down that steep hill. He ain't gonna want to walk on that steep hill. I don't like walking on a hill, but our feet are this far apart, our walk.
Yeah.
So then you have an elevation change of 1 foot. So that's tough for him. A steep hill, definitely an insignificant trail. Maybe it's just some leaves tufted up, especially if you got a lot of pressure, maybe top and bottom. Something rugged, tough to get to. And I feel like these deer, they there's kind of a seam that they kind of stay in. They don't just go up and down mountains. Like they're efficient with their you can see, like coming out of spring, like out of winter, they're still fat compared to the other deer. They're real efficient with their energy. So they might change elevation 100 feet, maybe 50 feet, but there's like maybe a cushion of area that they stay in, and it's a lot of times it is on the hillsides where they're not bothered, and they can either get thermals falling or rising, stuff like that. I feel like they feel like they're hidden more, when they're on them ridges, maybe a narrow, like a spine or something, they're just really exposed. I've seen deer just over the ridge. Bucks, mature deer, I feel like they could see the ridge, but their body's not exposed. I feel like they're safe on them hillsides and rugged area, and I think keeps a lot of people away in them areas.
Well, going into this season for guys like, I want to try and get your piece of advice for somebody. If we have listeners out there that haven't had the consistent success finding, targeting, and even getting opportunities at mature whitetails, but that's their goal. Like some people, it might not be their goal, but for a guy's goal, they want to go out and find and target and try to kill some mature whitetails, no matter in the area of the country they're in. What would you tell them is something to focus on going into this season to hopefully get them on the straight and narrow path to start building confidence in order to have that success?
So, like if you're looking for a mature deer, there's 3 things I used to talk about that they kind of need to survive is terrain, something rugged, cover, or something inaccessible, maybe across the lake, river or something so flat, maybe on an island. I don't know. Them are three things that I feel like you find that. First, you're going to find a mature deer. Then bring in consideration if anybody, and if it's inaccessible, chances are, or bring in the consideration where people are going to enter, and you might have to do the opposite of what most people are going to do. But just be aware of, I think, the hunting pressure, because it's pretty much everywhere, and just get away from where the normal people are going to be. Find that cover, find the terrain, and something inaccessible to where these deer are going to live. Maybe the rut is crazy. I used to always take off and hunt the rut, but it's hard to predict deer, and a lot of guys are in the woods. Maybe not just finding a place where hunters aren't, but the times that hunters aren't there also. Maybe a late season type time when guys are out of there, they and they need to feed more, they're going to be back into that area that guys aren't. So it's not just, or maybe real early, I'm going to try to focus on some rugged areas this year and some mountain areas early, where the pressure's not there yet, you know what I mean? But be optimistic, and just, you got to have a good work ethic, and talk to other people, but it's kind of like a balanced scale, like, don't listen to everything you hear, but talk to as many people as you can, listen to podcasts, and draw your own conclusions, and it's not black and white. And so hopefully that maybe helps people out, Jake.
Yeah, there's a lot of gray area in whitetails, and like you said, you got to take everything with a grain of salt, but you got to figure out, someone who you can relate with their hunting style and maybe a similar habitat area that you hunt in, and try to go out and test it for your own area and do a good job with it. Don't test it 1 or 2 days. Actually put some time into it and see if it works for you.
Yeah.
Because when we have listeners that do that, and they find a guest that we have on the podcast, maybe like yourself, who they do something a very specific way that a listener is like, I think I can replicate that. That's when we start having listener success stories come in. And we have hundreds of those that come in every year, where guys find a guest or two that they really enjoy. And they listen to a lot of the episodes, but they find 1 or 2 guests that do something very similar to, like, maybe their area of the country and a style that they get along with. And they implement it, and they start killing big deer and killing good deer, and they're having more success, and they're building more confidence, and then that's just going to keep compounding even into more success. So I think it's a really good point. Like, you got to take everything with a grain of salt, listen to everybody, but also figure out realistically what could work in your area, and actually go out there and do a good job testing it. Don't test it for a day or two, or scout for a day or two, and say this doesn't work. You actually got to put some time into it and trust the process. And when you find that success, start replicating it and ask why. Why did you have success?
Ask yourself a lot of questions. Why? And there's more than one way to skin a cat. And I try to stay away from, this is how you do it. You listen to other people and draw your, like, I used to have analogies where I'd say, hey, when I was younger, I had a toolkit for, working on a car. Now, like 30 years later, I have a huge toolbox like hunting's the same, that you need a lot of tools in your toolbox for working on this vehicle or that vehicle. You're not just going to use like a 9/16 wrench to take off every bolt and work on a car, So the more tools you have in your toolbox, the more things you can work on, it's just like hunting. The more things that you have learned and the different situations you can apply, your tool or what you've learned out of your tool bag to work in this situation. But listen to everybody, but draw your own conclusions. You might see something that nobody else sees, and then a lot of it's situational. Scenarios are all different. There's so many variables. Like, your area might be kind of comparable to what Johnny Stewart said in this area, but then Dan Infalt said this here, so mine's kind of halfway between. So let's pull a little bit here and a little bit here. Maybe it fits my area, because I've had people ask me a lot of questions. Maybe show me a e-scouting map and say, where would you hunt? I'm like, they asked me one question, I'm going to ask you 25. I mean, this is like, there's a lot to know, because I've been in so many scenarios, and there's no 2 identical scenarios out there in hunting. There's hunting pressure is different, the landscape's different, the habitat all over. I've hunted enough areas, enough states that it's diverse. It's changing everywhere. So it's like, and I talk about the balance scale, like one time I would do something to get a result, it would be like this, and then another time I do the opposite to get this result in a different state or something. It's like you're doing different things. You said it, like if you listen to someone says, do this, hunt this way, you got to be careful. If he's hunting the identical area to you, which is hard to find, you can go an hour away and it's going to be different.
Absolutely.
So if you're listening to this guy talk about how to do it, this is what to do, and you're an hour away, and you might be able to use it, but then if you're 3 states over, it's like, that doesn't work for me. But that doesn't mean, listen to what he says and maybe a scenario that you come up on. But that's what I like about the hunting, is these mature deer. There's no two. Every time I go in the woods, it's changing, whether it's a place I go to every year or a different state. Different deer die off, the habitat changes, they log, different hunting pressure, and you got to keep learning all that shit. And
that's the most frustrating thing about hunting timberland, where there's no guarantee when there's going to be another cut happening and how much it can change the overall deer pattern. Like you hunt a spot for 2 or 3 years, you kind of figure out what the deer are doing based off how the habitat and how the existing clear cuts and everything are in this property. And then they come through and cut another ridge, and you're like, well, crap, that kind of changed stuff up, because now you have all this, especially in the summertime, this fresh new growth that they're going to feed on. They're going to shift bedding just a little bit. Now when the hunting pressure comes back, then they're going to shift around, and then that maybe thicker ridge top that they cut, now it's just a wide open space that nothing's really going to be using all that much.
And last year I made a mistake of using historical data. So I hunted last year in an area that was really productive the year before, and there was a little bit of a change of a cut. And I hunted to put too much eggs in one basket, and I hunted there, and the deer weren't there last year. And so it's like, and I'll struggle with, just hunting this spot because this worked last year, and you hunt like 2 spots last year that I picked out. I was like, these are good. They were good last year. And I didn't worry about scouting too much. I hunted these spots, and it was pretty much a bust. And the one area, I don't know if I was putting some scent in there, and the other area it was a little bit of a change in a cut. Things just changed, and they were doing some work in the area, and I said, and I was still, no, they're here, and I stuck with it, and have, other options available. Don't just, I've done it many times where I'd caught a deer in an area, and I said, he'll be here next year, and I lost him for 2 years. I found him 2 years later, half a mile away. But why wasn't he here? Who knows? Maybe another deer come in, pushed him out, or he'd been bumped too many times, too many hunters, but it's always changing and stuff like that. So.
Absolutely. Well, Johnny, appreciate you joining us on the podcast. Thanks for coming to the expo. It's great to finally see you. Again,
Yeah.
I was surprised. I didn't know you were going to be here, dude. And on Thursday, saw you guys, or Friday, whenever it was when y'all got here, and I was like, okay, this is going to be fun, dude.
Yeah.
Now we're going to have a freaking party.
It's a good time.
Awesome. Appreciate you coming,
All right,
brother. Thanks for
Jacob.
joining the podcast.
Yeah. All right, brother.
All right, guys, next on the podcast. And next on this segment, we've got Josh Teulker from the Before the Echo podcast. Josh, how you doing, brother?
Good. How are you?
Doing well, man. Let's hang out a decent amount this whole event here at the Mobile Hunters Expo. I was going to say, doing live stream podcast for Before the Echo and everything with Dan.
Yeah.
It's been pretty awesome, but I've been wanting to get you on the podcast and talk about, especially in the last few years, what's been like one of the bigger factors for you when it comes to consistently getting on and finding mature bucks in your area of the country?
Yeah, so I live in southern Indiana. And I travel all around the country hunting, though. I hunted in 6 different states last year. Just a plethora of time in the woods recently in the last few years. And the biggest thing for me is to get on big deer and more deer is I do whatever I can to lay my eyes on a buck. I killed 4 bucks this year, and 3 of the 4. And the 3 out-of-state ones, I laid eyes on them either the day I killed them or the day before I killed them. And I think a lot of guys kind of get married to an area. Like you pick a spot on a map out of state, and you're like, I'm going to go hunt this area. And then you kind of sit around there and try to, hope a buck into range. And I think if you can just start any kind of hunt, whether it's your home state or out of state, by just either driving around or putting your boots on the ground and scouting until you either find some extremely fresh sign that you are confident has been recently done, or lay your eyes on a buck. I think that was my key of becoming more successful. My Wisconsin buck I killed last year, he ran in front of me driving home from a hunt, our first hunt, and happened. I just pulled the map up real quick. I'm like, oh, there's public land here that he ran into, and killed him the next day. And then same with Nebraska. I bumped him the evening before season started, and went in there the next evening on September 1st and killed him. So same with Ohio. Ohio was a little bit different. It was a rut hunt, so things were going crazy in Ohio. But I saw him 2 hours before I shot him. I was scouting my way in. I looked up and I saw him kind of being chased around by another buck, and went and sat in there. And I think a lot of guys just get fixated on I have to be, I picked this spot out. This is where I'm going to sit. Whereas you got to be where the deer are, and the best way of being where the deer are is putting your eyes on one.
So the Wisconsin deer. That's something that's really interesting to me. Is you saw them cross the road onto public.
Yeah.
And you pulled up your maps, saw it. What was your game plan going into hunting that deer? Because I think it's happened to me. It's happened to probably a lot of listeners where they've had a situation. They're driving through some public or next to some public. They see that big buck cross, maybe just before legal light, maybe during legal light, or even just after legal light, and they're like, whoa. What was your steps in order to try to pinpoint that deer and kill him the next day?
Yeah, so I'll walk back and kind of describe how we saw him. Me and Dan were hunting a different property, kind of, same general area, but down the road from this spot. And I don't know exactly what time it was. It was after dark, maybe by an hour, however long it took us to get back to the truck and drive down the road. And we looked out to the right, and he was standing in a cornfield just to the right of the road. And it was a gigantic cornfield. So to me, initially I was like, there's no way he came from, not no way, but probability is he didn't come from all the way back there already this early in the nighttime, or whatever you want to call it, after dark. So I kind of like, maybe he crossed the road because he was right next to the road down into where there was some public land. And Dan wrote it off. He just was like, you're not going to kill that thing. He'll tell you that too. But that afternoon, then I didn't mess around with him in the morning. I just left it. And then around 1 o'clock, I parked in the parking lot, almost right where he crossed. He was right next to the parking area. But I just kind of made my way down to where I thought I could find some sign, because there was actually another field right there on the other side of the road that he came off of, but then it was real quick turned into a river bottom. And I got down in there and I saw a really nice fresh rub. I'm like, oh, this is good, and then that river that was down there, the river bottom, made a really nice oxbow. And I'm like, I bet some deer, and this was getting to be, it was like October 19th, it was getting to be kind of ruddy. And I'm like, if he's down in here, he has to come through this oxbow right here, either coming in or out of it. And I there was only one tree you could set up in. It was like a marsh grass river bottom area. Cool. And I was setting, I don't know, probably as high as your sign there, just 10 feet off the ground. And he came right through the pinch of that oxbow. I shot him at like, 15 yards.
And what time did you get that shot off?
Oh, I mean, I went in the woods around 1 or so, and I was setting in. I probably got set up finally around 3 after I kind of slowly made my way in there and assessed everything. I probably shot him maybe, I don't know, probably 4 o'clock, if I remember right, which it's on Central Time up there, so it's not quite as late as what you'd think. Yeah, but yeah,
that's what I'm saying. So he was moving a decent bit before dark was going to happen.
Yeah, it was. Wow. I got back to the vehicle before it got dark, so not with him.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
I got my stand back off my back and all that stuff before dark.
That's really interesting, just based off like that observation, because Dan talked a little bit about having an observation too, and some of it's not super relatable when you're like, okay, you're glassing fields and stuff like that, at least for some of the guys in the Southeast, if you're not hunting that kind of ag. But in that situation where you kind of saw him off to the side and just assumed based off how far he was from that public, he's probably coming from the public, cutting that sign. Did you ever cut any big tracks as well going in there, or was it pretty much that rub that really caught your attention?
It was mostly the rub. I'll be honest with you, like it was, it's that marsh grass, so they're not like leaving a whole bunch of tracks. But no, I never. It was more just I laid eyes on him, and the rub was super fresh. Like you could tell it had been made recently, and it was just like a process of elimination. Then next, I look at a map, I'm like, okay, if I was a big buck, I think I'd be in this oxbow, and or I'd be at least coming through to check that oxbow, and that's what he was doing.
God, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah,
now
it was fun.
Also with that, so like for you, it's talking about really like trying to find the freshest sign. The freshest sign is actually visually seeing the deer, number one. So if you can get an observation 100%. On him and you can kind of figure out what he's doing, take that in consideration.
Yeah.
Like but how are you doing that, especially if you like bump that deer? Like say like your Nebraska buck, you bumped him the night before. What was the plan? Because since you bumped him, did he see you, smell you, a little bit of both?
I think it was more of a hear thing for that buck.
Okay.
I mean, there's a chance he saw me, but it was one of those things where you got to read it. Like that buck. I bumped him, so I don't know if you guys can imagine this, but it was like in Nebraska, it's a bit different than in the Midwest or the South. There's a lot of open, like, plains areas, and then there was some draws in the middle of these open plains, and they were full of oaks. The draws were, and then that was the low area, and then on top was the plains and the crop fields and all that other stuff. So these bucks were bedding in these draws. And I had scouted this giant piece of public, and I was actually walking back to the truck, and I was probably 100 yards from the road, and I'm like, I haven't looked at that draw yet. It was right alongside the road, and I'm like, I'm just going to go over there. I don't have anything else to do. It was the day before season. I was just sitting around anyway if I wasn't going to be scouting. And I just went in there, and I was going real slow, and I got into that draw, and I kind of looked up. I heard something. I looked up, and there was 2 bucks in that draw, and one of them kind of spooked out of there and ran off, but it wasn't real hard. And then the other one actually jumped up and just like looked at me for a while. I just stood there real slow, and you could tell he was just kind of looking around, like trying to figure out what did they heard walk in there, and he just kind of turned around and walked off. So I knew I didn't I wasn't like all that stuff going out of there. And this is September 1st, granted. So they're on this summer pattern. They haven't been hunted yet all year. So that's all factored in, And I'm not in Michigan here where they've seen, 40 people the first day of season or anything like that. And yeah, I came in. I didn't mess with him in the morning. I just stayed out, slept in, and that evening, and it got dark there at like 9:30. It was early season, and then that evening. I went in there early too. I got in there like 2:00, and
Is this on the Beast on the YouTube channel?
Yeah, both of these hunts are
pretty heavily timbered bottom.
Yeah,
I think I remember watching this hunt because
Yeah.
did he come across like the drainage from you, kind of working down the edge of it?
Yeah, and he walked with over 20 yards and into those oaks to feed.
Okay,
and I ended up killing him. He's just a nice 10-pointer.
Yeah. So interesting. Okay, yeah, because it makes once you were explaining, I'm like, okay, I've seen that video before.
Yeah.
And that was kind of interesting as well, just based off again that kind of soft bump or getting him up. He didn't really know, and he kind of eased off. The younger deer kind of probably saw you, heard you, whatever, and then he got out there a lot hotter.
Yeah.
Andrew did it last year in Georgia. Similar situation in early season. We were hunting in Georgia. Jumped a buck up out of a bed in a draw in a small drainage around a clear cut, and it was probably more of a hearing thing as well. I don't think the deer smelled him, and I don't think he could see him because when he got up, Andrew could kind of make out his rack, but not great when he got up, like probably 50, 60 yards from him. He went back in there and hunted that same spot in the morning around that bed, thinking that buck would probably come back to bed. It was going to be a little bit cooler that morning, come back a little bit later, and he shot the buck, coming back in there like at 9 o'clock.
Nice.
Nice. So whether it was that buck or another buck,
Right.
But came right back in within 20 yards of that bed and killed it. And which is, again, kind of interesting because you hear a lot of guys in the Southeast say you can't do that, but because that's our thing. You hear a lot of guys in the Southeast, and we've even said this on the podcast sometimes, like it's hard to translate some of the beast stuff down in our area. It seems like in some areas where it's hard to pinpoint a bed that they're using multiple times. It almost seems like they shift around a little bit with some of those deer. But every now and then you'll find that buck, and you'll find that buck that like just at the time of the year you're there, he's using it a decent amount and go in there and actually kill that deer in and around that bedding location.
Yeah.
Which is kind of fascinating. So one other thing I wanted to kind of bring up with you, since you do travel a good bit, and also you said draw, which I was a little happy about. You do got a little southern twang to you, okay? That's so. You might be in southern Indiana. That's more north than Andrew would call the south, but you might be a designated partial southerner at that point.
There's a lot of rednecks in my area.
Yeah, dude, I like it, man. So I want to ask you this as kind of a final thought for this segment. Going into this season, if a guy, a listener to the podcast, hasn't had the consistent success, his goal is to try to target a mature whitetail. Public land, private land, doesn't matter, but he's been struggling. What would you tell them or give them a piece of advice to focus on this year to help them get on kind of a straight and narrow path to kind of build some confidence on and hopefully start building some success with that?
Yeah, I would just instead of like feeling like you have to be in a tree or whatever your preferred method of hunting is, like I would just keep scouting until you feel that confidence and you see that that sign or you see that buck. I think too many people like, oh, it's 3:30. I have to get in a tree now, and they just go up and it's like now you're just wasting your time sitting over this blanket of nothing.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, I think the people do that because they're afraid of making a mistake, and you have to just go out there and make a bunch of mistakes until you push the envelope too far and bump that buck too hard, and learn from that, and then use that information that you gain from having an encounter with a deer to make your next move more calculated. And I think people are so afraid to make some kind of a move that they're almost too timid, and they end up out of the game all the time because they're worried that they're going to spook a deer out of the country. And in reality, dude, they don't go very far. Like I said, you may not count that Wisconsin buck as spooking him per se because we're in a truck. I'm sure 100 trucks drive by him, every week. But the rest of those deer, like the Ohio buck, all of them, they knew I was there for at least a few seconds. So I mean, there was a study in PA that showed that like those there's 1,000 or so deer collared, and dude, they don't go very far. Like they don't, like the mature deer just don't move very far from where they're comfortable. There's a reason that they're laying there. There's a reason they spook. They're going to come back more than likely, and set up camp again where they're comfortable and they know how to detect danger coming into where they're living. So
yeah, I brought this up on the podcast before. Because you'll hear guys talk about, like, you spook that buck, he's nocturnal, you're never going to see him again for the rest of the year, he's out of the country.
Yeah.
But if he totally moved that far, that's how they'd get shot. And that they would never make it to 5 or 6 years old if that was the case. If they were, every time they got bumped, they completely shift to a new area.
Yeah.
And that's when I've looked at some of the GPS data as well, and like you look at it, and like you can't necessarily, I don't know the data that you had if you had hunter data as well about actually deer and hunter encounters, but like you see how close a lot of these bucks are bedded to the road and access points. That was the eye-opening thing for us. Like probably we had data, I think it was 18 or 20 bucks down in South Alabama that Auburn, University of Auburn, or Auburn University, whatever they say it, did a collar deer study on both public and private land, and how close like 85% of those deer were to access points and like roads. Yeah. And like maybe not like parking lot, but like maybe you have a gate, there's a gated road that you have to walk in from, and they're bedded like in a little low spot or like a little secondary point right off that road, like 60 yards from the road.
Yeah.
And you're like, most of these guys are walking in way past, and they can hear you walking down the gravel road too, if you're popping gravel in your boots. And it's like they know you're there, and it always seems like the second nighttime would hit, they're kind of like moving around that little bedding, that little tight little core area. And a second nighttime hit, they're up on that road.
Yeah. And
they're crossing the road, or that they're swinging around, checking part of it. And it makes you wonder when you watch a buck all fall, because we had everyday data of these deer that Andrew put into a map format, because it was just data points that he plugged into maps and everything. So we actually see hour by hour data points of where these bucks were at, and how they shifted around. And like some bucks, they all have different personalities, but some bucks would have a little bit wider, I guess, nighttime home range. Others, not so much. They were like, for you to be on that deer, you had to be within a 50-acre spot, or you would never even know the deer was there. And that's in a little bit more of a timber country, clear-cut kind of habitat area, no ag or anything there. And it's like they weren't ranging super far. And then you could see the uptick as we started getting close to the rut, and these bucks started doing these excursions. You could see it on the map, and you could see all these points and how they get out wider and wider. And all of a sudden, one day, this buck goes from being in his core area to 3/4 of a mile away in an area he hasn't been to all fall. And he's there for 2 days. And then he comes back.
Hot day over there or something.
I guess, man. And it's like, it's fascinating. But yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Again, kind of guys start focusing on some of that stuff and really trying to focus on building that success, and also probably asking why. This is something that you probably do I think a lot of guys do this without even like noticing it, but like, why am I seeing this sign? Why am I seeing this buck here? Or why am I not seeing what I should be seeing in this area? Is there other hunting pressure here? And you look around, there's a stand hanging there, or there's a camera hanging there. And I think the more people start asking why, like, why is this working? Why is this not working? You'll start getting to the bottom of the question of like, how are these bucks using these areas, and how can I go about finding these bucks and staying on these deer throughout that fall?
Yeah.
Awesome.
For sure.
Well, hey, Josh, real quick, if someone wants to listen to the Before the Echo podcast, how can guys watch the live stream version and also get the audio version if they want to check it out?
Yeah, so the audio version's always on any of your typical podcast listening platforms. And then me and Dan do the actual show live on YouTube on the Before the Echo YouTube channel. That's usually, we do them pretty consistently on Thursday nights, and we try to do one other one during the week. So there's usually 2 that pop up every week.
Awesome.
Yeah,
awesome.
but you get on there and ask Dan questions or myself, and it's a pretty cool little system we have to interact with the fans.
And when he says Dan, some listeners might know, but doesn't know, but it's Dan Infalt.
Yeah, Dan Infalt. Yeah,
to give everybody an idea.
Yeah.
But yeah,
and then all the hunts and stuff I do are on the Hunt and Beast channel.
Yep, awesome.
So,
well, perfect.
Yeah.
Well, Josh, thanks for joining us,
Yeah,
brother.
thanks for having me on.
All right, guys, in the next segment, we are joined by Tyler Westell of Indiana. And Tyler, dude, appreciate you joining us on the podcast.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited. So you've been staying with us at Airbnb, and I met you last year at the last year's Mobile Hunters Expo that was in Ohio.
Yep.
But you had to learn a little bit more about you and your hunting style, really just because we stayed at the Airbnb together and started hearing stories on my dude. I felt like we had to do a segment on this podcast episode. So I want to kind of get into, for you, what's been like one of the biggest factors for you when it comes to finding and targeting mature bucks in your area of the country?
A lot of e-scouting.
Okay.
I use a lot of Onyx, Hunt Stand, Spartan Forge. Google Maps does a lot for me. Just looking at, I like to go back on Google Maps and look at the history, the dates. You go back and you can see a lot of those edges that weren't there before, like old fence rows and stuff that are growing up. That's really what I use a lot to find those big deer.
So with aerial scouting, this is something I love to do, and you brought up old fence rows, and I've hunted some spots where like you'd have to go back pretty far on some of that aerial imagery, but you find these old fence rows growing in places that used to be old pasture. Now, if you looked at it on recent imagery, it's just big timber.
Big timber.
And then you get in there, and all those bucks are running that old fence row, and there's big trees growing up around it, and it's just some thick cover, maybe some cedars and stuff mixed in. So I want to pick your brain on that, but a little bit more about the e-scouting. What do you think is some of the biggest factors for you when it comes to the e-scouting aspect, as in what's going to hold a mature buck, or you're going to catch a mature buck transitioning from one area to another? Like, what are some of those things that maybe pop up at you when you're looking at aerial imagery, especially maybe say like, Google Earth or Onyx or anything like that, where you're kind of going back and you're trying to figure out, why should a big buck be in that area?
So I can talk about a current spot that I'm scouting right now. It's public, southern Indiana. So I have it, how it's set up is it's hill country with a ridge system that dumps off into private bean fields. And then on the edge of that private bean field, there's a public swamp that's there too. It's CRP, cattails, pin oaks, and what I'm looking for is that diversity. There's just tons of different edges there. You have swamps, you have the hill country that bucks like. I mean, it's just, I'm looking for different stuff like that.
So anywhere where you find a lot of that diversity kind of in one area, that's going to be a hot spot that you're going to be kind of pay attention to and get in there. In your opinion, with that diversity, because I kind of get my thoughts on it, but why do you think those mature bucks like traveling or being in those areas with all that habitat diversity?
For me, I think it's, they have the early season beans. They got their red oaks, they got their white oaks, they got those, they got the native grasses in there, tons of cover, water. I mean, that deer doesn't have to go anywhere. I mean, he's there hidden. And I will say, when I did go scout that the other day, when I came in from the parking lot, the wind was blowing from the parking lot to where he was bedded. I actually bumped him out of there, and he was bedded kind of like in a little bit of an oxbow, overlooking the swamp. He was still kind of in the hill country, but overlooking the swamp, and I bumped him out of there, and it's just perfect setup.
Now, in that kind of situation, and that, the aerial scouting and finding that diversity has been a huge factor for you when it comes to like having that success. How do you like to go about using that in hunting? Is this something that when you find that diversity, will that work at any point of the season? Do you like that a little bit more for like the early season rut hunting, or, what is your thought process on those super high diversity areas, and do they hold bucks throughout the year, or is there certain times of the year that it's more proficient?
I feel like they can hold deer all times of the year. I mean, I hunted out in Illinois late November last year, and mid-November, and killed one out there. And it's the same thing, swamp. hill country, and it's still holding deer.
Also, do you feel like some of those areas gets a little bit more pressure with that diversity? Do you feel like there's other guys that like are looking for that, or is it still kind of less discussed or less focused on by like the average hunter that's out there on public land?
I would think the average hunter, I feel like some of those guys, man, they feel like they just have to get out really far. And some of these deer I've killed, like the one I killed in Illinois, I was 400 yards from a parking lot. One I killed here in Indiana 2 years ago, I walked 30 yards out of the woods and I can see my truck and sit in the parking lot. I feel like it probably does get looked over a little bit, especially if it's not as far as a walk.
That's the thing. It's like, it's one thing if you find that if the guys are looking at the map and that, habitat diversity's a mile in, they're like, oh, that looks good. It's far, it's farther from the parking lot. I can get away from pressure, even though they're probably going to walk in with other guys doing the exact same thing. Versus if you find that habitat diversity a little bit closer to the parking lot, that might be one of those things that guys are overlooking because it is so close to the truck. Like the buck you said you killed in Indiana that you were like, you could walk out 30 yards from the woods and you could see your truck. What made that spot or like that kind of habitat so special that like you keyed in on that? Was it some sign you found in addition to the aerial imagery?
Yeah. It was a pine thicket sitting at the bottom of a rut funnel with a big creek bottom, a lot of thickets. Thicket, a lot of that nettle stuff, tall grasses down there. And honestly, I didn't even scout that area that year. It's a place that I've hunted for the last 3 years, and we always have deer there walking through that thicket beginning of October. So I was like, opening day, I'm going to go sit there. Sure enough, opening day, 9:30, here he comes.
On a morning hunt too, opening day. Okay, well, let's talk about that a little bit. I hear, we're from the Southeast, and I still love hunting mornings in the early season, but you see so much in outdoor media, especially like some of the real big name people, not necessarily in the mobile hunting space, but like if you think of outdoor television, man, you don't hunt mornings October. You wait until maybe that last couple days of October start hunting mornings, but you're hunting mostly evenings. What's your thought process on hunting mornings, especially early season?
Evenings are better. The reason I hunted the morning then, I just couldn't wait to get out. And it was a spot that I didn't scout, but I knew from previous history that, hey, if I go out here and hunt, I might have a chance at a good deer in the morning, and I'm not going to burn my other – I was saving my other stuff for the evening hunts. And I was like, I'm just, wanted to get out in the woods. This first day, I was ready to go.
And so that's kind of funny. A guy we've interviewed on the podcast a few times, Jonathan Moreland. He's from eastern Arkansas. Kills a lot of big bucks. He kills most of them in the evenings, but one of his bigger bucks, his biggest buck he's killed is in the mid-180s. It was on a morning hunt, but he killed it right around noon, or right after he got in the stand. He got it kind of late morning, and he killed it midday in October on a feed tree. But he was saying the same thing. He's like, my time is very precious when I hunt. So he's like, if I have time to hunt, I'm not going to go on a morning hunt, even though it's early season. I might go to that secondary location, like you said. Like I might say my best spots where I know I have a good opportunity in the evenings. I'll go to an area like you said that maybe you've scouted in the past. There's always been good activity there, or it's an area you really kind of want to dive into. But instead of throwing an evening sit out, I'm going to go in a morning, see what opportunities I have, see if I see any visuals on any kind of bucks or anything, and then based off that decision, I may go to my my primary location that evening that I know I have a lot better chance based off how you scout it and what's in the area. So that's kind of interesting, almost like using those morning hunts, morning sits early season as a way to almost kind of like test the water, some spots, and kind of a little bit, even though you've been in the area, almost like hunting blind, like you hadn't been in there really scouted it, that year. So you just kind of knew the area, you knew how it laid out, knew probably a tree to get into or some trees to get into, climbed in, and just based off the annual historical pattern you've seen in that area the last 3 years, had an opportunity, you were able to capitalize on that deer. Yep,
you have about 3 to 4 days because of the parking lot where it's set up at. Everyone walks right through it, and they walk to the back. So I knew that if I was going to have opportunity, I was like, I'm just going to try it out for first day and see what happens. And 3 hours into the hunt, I'm dragging a deer out.
Is it not funny how that is like the most common thing you can think of? Like so many guys, like, because they've heard for the last 10, 15 years about going deep, like go as far as you can, that you can almost guarantee if there's a parking lot and there's like a log road or access path that goes really far back, most of your pressures are going to be back wherever that log road stops at. And guys are just like, oh, I'll walk. We had a gentleman from Georgia we had on the podcast a long time ago, probably 4 years ago now, Glenn Solomon, episode 116. who I called him kind of like the Dan Infalt of the South. He was hunting buck beds for the last 40 years in the Southeast on public land, killing some hammers on public doing so. And he was doing, and he always talked about, he's like, guys, they may feel like they'll walk far from the axis, but they're not getting off a logging road. They're going to stay on a path. They may walk 1.5 miles, 2 miles in if they can, but they're only going to be within 100 to 150 yards off that logging path at the very most, because a lot of guys just feel they don't want to get away from the access path in case their phone died or the light went out, all that kind of stuff. At least they know they could walk back to that logging path or whatever the access point is and then walk it straight back to their truck. So it's like when you take that out of consideration and also thinking that most guys are going to walk back deep, if you find that diversity a little bit closer to that access point, which has kind of been a common theme of this episode. We've had a few guys mention this so far about find that diversity in those habitat edges close to the parking areas, or a gate where guys are going to be parking at, and those bucks kind of get held tight there, more so for the reason that nobody hunts there. So it's the only place that doesn't have pressure. Like, they're going to hear people talking and trucks doors slammed and stuff, but they're going to stay in that area because nobody pushes in there. They walk right past it.
Yeah, and you get a lot of people that don't want to. I feel like you put water in the mix with it, you're getting rid of probably 95% of the people. People don't want to they don't want to cross water. They don't want to. If you have to put waders on or anything like that, you're getting rid of a lot of people.
Absolutely, and also if it's one of those places you have to put waders on, but it's still not big enough to put a boat in there, it doesn't make sense to put a boat or canoe because maybe it's only 15 yards wide and it's one of those little spots. Like there's a couple spots in a couple different states I think of like this where if you were to take a boat in there, it'd be so much more hassle because the boat doesn't really help you all that much when it comes to access. Maybe there's not a place to put a boat in or put a kayak in. Unless you're going to take that water further down, if you're just trying to cross it, nobody's going to take a boat in there just to do that. So in most guys, I keep chest waders in my truck the last couple seasons in case you run into that spot where like I can run back to the truck, get some PVC chest waders, pack them in with me. They roll up on my backpack, get there, drop my boots, put them on, cross that water, drop them on the other side, and keep hiking with my boots, with my other boots. And that is a very good point. You get in those spots, and it's funny how the human presence in most of those cases completely disappears at that point. And like you said, that could be 40 yards from a parking area, and that buck could be on the other side of that water right there in that little thick spot. Spot in Missouri comes to mind. That scout is exactly like that. Just thick multifloral rose thicket on the back side of this parking area that nobody would want to walk through. And there was a deep ditch with some water in it, and everybody would take an access path going much further down to this public. I was like, I'm gonna go check this back corner. The back corner of the property wasn't 200 yards from this parking area. And the second I got through that multifloral rose, which is gnarly walking through, getting all tore up and stuff, sticking on the other side of it, I could still see my car, still see my truck. There's like rubs and scrapes everywhere right there on the backside of this thicket. And then it kept going, went down through that ditch, across that water, came up the other side of the next ridge, and it was just heavy, heavy sign. And from previous year, this was like early September, and there's some fresh rubs happening already. And then you can see all the historical rubs from the past and big licking branches and scrapes. I'm like, dude, this is the spot. You know what's funny? I scout a lot of those places. I never go back to hunt them. So I still got to go to Missouri and hunt that spot.
I have a lot of spots that I scout that I never end up touching.
Yeah. It's like it's pretty common because you kind of get a feel like I'm just gonna go run in here. You find some good stuff, but like, man, I already get some other areas I'm pretty dialed into.
Get 5-6 pictures at 5-6 different areas, and I'm like, what do I need to go to this place for now?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as a point of kind of wrapping up this segment, Tyler, can you give me like your thoughts if there's guys listening to this podcast that they haven't had the consistent success even finding and targeting mature bucks. They want to get to that point of being able to harvest their first mature buck. What would you tell them to kind of focus on? Taking kind of maybe habitat out of the equation for the most part. What would you tell them to kind of focus on in order to start building that success and building that confidence in order for them to go out there and not only target a mature buck but get opportunities potentially?
Well, so I mean, for me, like before 2019, I have 2 or 3 deer that are maybe 130, and in the last 4 or 5 years, I've killed it, and I owe it really. Listening to Dan Infalt, getting on YouTube and watching Jacob Schmidt Deer School,
awesome,
and reading and just getting my hands on everything I could. I mean, I wanted to get all the information I could for like the next 7 months, and I went out my first year and killed the biggest deer I ever killed, from just information on YouTube. It's there. You just got to put the time in and just studying. A lot of it is the terrain is what I first started with, and then I got into the edges, and then water access and other stuff like that. But really focusing on learning to read the maps, the terrain maps. That's where I started. I mean, aerial maps and.
When you brought up Jacob Schmidt, that was the first guest ever on this podcast back in 2018.
Really?
And I haven't talked to him in forever now. And we were recording that audio. I wouldn't even go back and listen to that podcast, guys. It's terrible, just from the host standpoint, not from him. He was great. Is he still putting video content out?
I didn't look at the dates, how old they were, but I've just been watching, like I said, his deer school 101.
Yeah, like he'd have like some of the most detailed aerial imagery. He's from Arkansas, lives in Arkansas. Had some of the most detailed map breakdowns of like deer movement and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I need to go check and see if he's still doing it, because I want to feel like a while ago I went to look and it seemed like he hadn't done anything in a few years. But just talking like a wealth of knowledge from a guy that's also from the Southeast, but it translates about how he talks about habitat edges, transition edges, corridors, all that kind of stuff, and be able to see it on a map where you can like, oh, okay, I can go apply this on my own piece of public or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's awesome. Well, cool. Well, Todd, thank you for joining me, brother.
Appreciate
and
it.
Best luck to you this season. Hopefully you kill a couple more hammers this year.
Yeah, I hope so.
Awesome. All right, guys, next on the segment, we've got our buddy Rendell Erik back on the podcast. He was on our last segment when we did this, or last podcast we did this at the Southern show for the Mobile Hunters Expo. Now we're at the Northern show for the Mobile Hunters Expo. But, Rendell, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing great, man.
Hey, listen, getting a little excited here. So, season's fast approaching us, and one thing I wanted to kind of talk to you about, it's a little bit different question that I've asked everybody else, just because I kind of asked you the same question last time, which was, what's one of the biggest factors for you when it comes to having the consistent success you've had, especially now after you moved to Iowa from Tennessee. But instead of asking that question, I want to talk to you about your thought process in scouting. You typically have a lot of success, especially before the rut over in Iowa, which is, again, kind of that time of the year most guys are like, kind of be a little more casual hunting, getting ready for November, and you're like, forget it, I'm going to try to kill one early.
That's my go time, my fave.
Well, see, that's what I want to talk about. So what is like your thought process when you go into like your speed scouting that you always talk about? Like, how do you go about scouting, both from like an observational scouting standpoint, but also boots on the ground? What are you looking to do in order to kind of put the pieces together where you're going to be at that first week or two of season?
Yeah, so I do all the postseason scouting, look for all the buck beds, bedding areas, and then maybe the transitional zones. If you can kind of see whatever browse they might come in and stage in. And then as I did all my homework as much as I possibly could, usually like 300 miles, maybe more some years. And then I transitioned that into the summer scouting, which I'll tell you what, I was like, I'm going to jump in and do a bunch of summer scouting, which I just did in Kentucky, before I go down there. And it sucks. Everybody knows it sucks.
Yeah.
So I'm like, no, I'm good. So I do like more glassing. I'm checking crop rotations. If I'm hunting somewhere new, I might go look for a browse type.
Mm-hmm.
Like you've been having a lot of episodes on different plants.
Oh, yeah.
Deer eat, and a lot of it's more nutrition than like main ag.
Absolutely.
And they come out and they'll stage in that. So I'm looking for that paired with what I found postseason. The beds, I think that'll be harder to hunt, so I'm finding that browse. And then I want to see the main rotation, because I feel like in the Midwest, especially Iowa, like I've said, I feel like they shift to corn pretty early, because it opens October 1st, so they're already on the corn before that. And then the phase before that, they're kind of on a hay green, maybe with some leftover acorns. So I'm trying to catch that transition in the Midwest. But if you're in more of an opening, like Missouri opens early, mid-September, Wisconsin. But you got like Dakotas that open right out the gate, Nebraska. So I'm looking for beans then, or white oaks going to be dropping early. And then the browse type back off of that. Because early, a lot of guys will try to get right on the beans and hunt the field edges. But I still think that I want to be off of that. I don't like hunting field edges early. Yeah. I think you possibly can if you're getting daylight pictures of the buck, but I like to slide in. I might not go all the way back to the 100-yard buffer like I normally want to be. I might maybe get halfway. Or we were talking about observation sits. I might go a couple of days early and just get as far away as I can. I'll usually hook a camera arm up in a tree, like maybe 10, 15 feet. Sometimes higher if I got to see down in the field. And I'll take a spot and scope, like a 20 by 65 by like 80, 85. A lot of guys use that smaller diameter, but the bigger diameter gives you more light, and those bigger bucks tend to come out even last light, even in before the season opens. And it's almost like they know too, there's a switch there, because you'll see all the deer on beans walking around daylight. Season opens, boom, they're back. But I think they're getting hammered with that field edge pressure. A couple days before, guys are putting cameras in, speed scouting. So I think it pushes them back. That's why I want to be in that first layer back in the staging type area where that browse is.
Yeah, well, let's talk about this because you're going to be hunting Kentucky this year, early season. So what was your thought process when we don't have to get specifics on exactly like how you're figuring out what public you wanted to go to, but when you found the area that you wanted to go to, when you were going to go in there for a couple of days and scout, what were you trying to find and figure out, mix with some of the ag? Like, again, what are you trying to focus on that you're trying to key in on? Plus, I know you hung a camera. You already got some bucks showing up on camera. So talk to me a little about your thought process going into that scouting.
So I went to any beans I could see off the road and immediately glassed those. And then my plan was I found as many bean fields as I could that are either on public or adjacent to public so I could glass into them. And if I had to walk back, I marked that a different color on my map so I know I have to go in there with a spotting scope and see back in there. And then I looked for alternate plans like white oaks, any kind of browse I could get into. So when I was looking on the aerials, I just e-scouted everything first. And then I thought, okay, using my experience from Iowa and some other Midwest states, where is the most likely place for a mature buck to be bedded? And I literally just pinned it a bunch as I could, and I just went right in. I didn't even look at anything else because you're not really looking for rubs and scrapes this time of year. I mean, you can find them. I found a couple, but I just went straight speed scout, straight in there because it's like 100 degrees, sweating to death. So I'm trying to figure out access. I go look at the spot, and I'm like, all right, yeah, there'd be a big buck here. Nope. And I just mark it off. If there is, I just hang a camera. I dropped a couple cell cams, just so I don't have to go back in there and check them. I can just go hunt. And then field edges, I tend to drop more like SD card cameras because I feel like I can roll in there and check them because I feel like Kentucky, you get a lot of pressure. Yeah. So I just use an experience. Like one spot I found on the aerial, I just found 2 old fields that were overgrown, and they kind of act like a clear cut. They had maples in there, berries, all types of other. I'm like, all right, he's going to be in there. And then I was walking to the spot that I seen that I really liked on the aerial. And if I went 50 yards one way or the other, it got super hot. But this one spot that I found, it was cold almost. And all the thermals out of those old field clear cuts were dumping right there. And then I had a mountain stream behind me. And then I used the mountain stream to access in there. Then I found the kill tree right on the bank of the mountain stream. I can come in, leave no scent, so I could hunt a couple days in a row. I got the thermals pulling to me. And there was a main trail off like maybe 100 yards to my left. And I was like, oh, a mature buck's not going to be on that trail. But I found that sliver trail coming down into that little micro thermal hub, if you want to call it. So I was like, oh, he's going to come down this. And then I hung the camera, caught him coming to the bean field like the next day.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So you were able to go in there and get off what most guys would be focused on, which is the beans itself. Yeah. Get back in the timber and kind of find that transition area where he's kind of coming from some bedding area, coming around and kind of using that little slope to his advantage before he jumps up into those actual beans.
Yeah, and there were some white oaks. I took my binos and I glassed up there, and there's some acorns growing, so those will drop. So he should stage right there. So feeding the clear cuts, hit those oaks, and then he'll move out. That's a spot I'll probably hunt really close right away because they move so slow when they're just browsing those old bucks like that. He's not like long lining like I talked about. He's not going straight out a long distance to the ag. He's staying pretty close. And then I look for spots like that would be a long lining spot, somewhere that had really good bedding but no food. And then there's beans like a mile away that I was like, okay, I think a buck would go to those beans. And then I found the best travel route that I thought in my mind a buck would use. And I just hung some cameras on that stuff. And then I do the same type of stuff in Iowa. I just speed scout right in because I spent a couple of years just looking at buck beds. Like 4 years, all I did was look at beds. Like hundreds of miles of just going in, looking at beds. So once you do that, you get experience and you look on the map how it sets up. Like I can go to different states and I can just speed in. And you might miss a bunch of overlooked stuff, but I don't know, man. I just rather have as many properties as I can because I'm trying to beat pressure too. So if I get pressure one spot, it keeps me mentally in the game because I got like 30 other spots lined up. So I just keep bouncing around like that. And I look for smaller too. I don't like giant. I think most guys are attracted to giant tracts of land. I don't like that because it's harder to scout, man, and figure it out. And you got movement, things are shifting. If you got one small piece, I'll pick out maybe one or two of the best spots in there, fly in there, scout it, hang the camera, gone. And I just keep jumping like that.
What do you think is what do you think how should I word this question? What do you think is a factor for guys when they're not having success, say summer scouting, like trying to find some of this stuff? I mean, do you think it's they get too tied up in the weeds of things and that they're not trying to like necessarily speed scout a bunch of spots and they maybe spend too much time in like one or two areas instead of checking a bunch of areas? Like, what do you think is some factors that's holding them back from finding that one spot? Do you think they're going too slow between locations, or what's your take on that?
Well, I think a lot of guys don't go ahead. They don't go beforehand and postseason scout. Like if you know you're hunting Kentucky, the best time to go, pick a weekend in January, roll down there with a buddy, and just cover as much ground as possible. I think a lot of guys try to figure out every little rub, scrape. I'm looking for major lines of movement, specific things that mature bucks do. Like I don't care about does or little bucks. After you scout so much, you know what to key in on. So a lot of it's just woodsmanship, experience. Mm-hmm. And then they get on these big tracts of land and they think they have to scout it all because I think they worry about the little piece getting pressure, where I find all the people gravitate to the big because, oh, man, if I get pressure, I can bounce way over here, bounce way over that. And that's, man, it can be overwhelming. Like you get in there and then you get some pressure on you and deer shifting. And guys are worried about what deer are doing right now, and I could care less what a deer is doing right now, honestly. I'm trying to predict, like, what I talked about in the last thing we did about moving with the deer. I'm trying to predict the shift, food sources that are shifting. Like, the season evolves so fast. Like, guys are just too worried about, like, now. They see that buck out there, and they're like, oh, I'm setting up right there. Well, that deer's probably not going to be there. I mean, he could be, but the odds of it are not very good. So I think it's just a higher percentage of efficiency if you're thinking forward thinking. And I'll even use other guys, like I was talking to you about thermal hubs, all right? I think everybody and their dead grandma, dead grandpa, you know what I mean, are going to be in a thermal hub this year. So I'm predicting that. So I've been looking at thermal hubs, and I'm like, all right, where would this buck shift to? So I'm going to hunt that mostly, I think, because I'm going to catch that movement. So I'm going to actually use other hunters to my advantage by playing off of them,
knowing that they're probably going to get down those thermal hubs, and they're probably going to push the deer out of there. So, like, where those deer are going to shift to if that pressure's down in those hubs.
Yeah, and they're super hard to hunt because wind swirl, thermals. A lot of those mature bucks are smart. They might not move into that hub until after daylight, after the thermal shift, and they come on that high wall. So you have to be up on that high wall or you're toast. There's so many things that go into a hub, wide versus steep.
Tight versus
and I like the really steep ones because I find most of my mature bucks are in there because it's harder to hunt. Because all the thermals are dumping so fast in there, the wind swirls a lot more. So I find that a lot of guys like the wider ones, they're easier to hunt, but the bigger bucks that I find are usually in the steeper ones.
Awesome. Well, perfect. Well, Rendell, appreciate you joining us back on the podcast. Best luck to you this season. And, hey, guess what? I'm excited to be hunting with you in Alabama this year, man.
Yeah,
it's going to be a good time.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Three buck state.
It's
going to be awesome to get down there in the rut and try to put some Alabama deer down.
Yeah, listen, that's what I was saying. It's like if Rendell comes down to Alabama and kills some good deer with his bow, which there's a good chance he will, especially in the area that we're going to be hunting, it's going to be awesome. So super excited to have you down there, brother. But appreciate you stopping by.
Can't wait. Thank you.
All right, guys, our last segment of the podcast. And last but not least, we have Dieter Kochan on the podcast, who's been a seminar host and guest this whole week. So, Dieter, I've first off thoroughly enjoyed your seminar. A little bit about you. First off, we're going to get you on the Southern Outdoorsman podcast at some time soon. But you're in law enforcement and deal with a lot of canine handling, which is pretty fascinating. So I know you had listened to an episode we did with Tom Brownlee about a year or so ago. And I think we're going to have you on because you get some other interesting pieces of details that you've actually explained in your seminar that I think we're going to discuss. But we'll say that for another episode. But on this episode, Dieter, I want to know what's been like one of the biggest factors for you when it comes to finding and consistently getting on mature bucks in the UP of Michigan.
Yeah, I think the biggest part for me is trying to be well-rounded. I mean, the deer rarely are going to do what you what you want them to do or what you have planned out. You can have your season planned at the beginning of the year, and it's going to end up going in a completely different direction half the time. So I think I was lucky enough that early on I was kind of forced to learn a bunch of different hunting styles, because I played professional hockey for 10 years. I played a lot in the minors, so I was moving to different states every year. So I think the first state I lived in was in Kentucky, and then I was in New York, and then I was in Massachusetts, then in Connecticut, and then in Maine. So every year I was forced to, on the fly, locate new areas, hunt mobile just because I didn't know how long I'd be in that area, and attack deer in completely different environments. And that taught me just a bunch of different tactics and strategies, whether it was, in Binghamton, New York, it was kind of hill country. And then in Massachusetts, we were right near the ocean, so you had some of that salt marsh type stuff. And then in Connecticut was completely different too, because it was, it was kind of swamps and woods, and so just a variety of different things. And I think being well-rounded gives you the ability to kind of roll with the punches. And whether I'm in Michigan or in a different state and I'm kind of pushed by other hunters, I think I can react and get it done in a variety of different situations.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and I'm glad you brought that, like almost being like just a really well-rounded and versatile whitetail hunter. And you can probably even elaborate even more on this, but like the more you experience in different areas and different habitat types, if you can find success on getting on deer and opportunities of killing some of those bucks, you learn so much from that you then can take to a different area. Maybe it's a completely different habitat type, but you can take what you learned in this one area and kind of work there, and how the bucks use that habitat type. And maybe you go from those swamps, that hill country, and the habitat's not the same, but bucks are still bucks. They're still going to use that cover in the same way, and transition edges and everything else. You just got to repattern what they're doing in the different habitat type, and then in order to have success. But once you do that in enough places, you build up your toolbox of skill sets on how to hunt deer in different areas that you then can take back to your home state or wherever you're living at, and it being even more versatile and well-rounded in those areas. Yeah,
and it's even throughout a season. I mean, there's different. For me, there's the early season, and then there's a pre-rut and rut, and then there's a late season, and then being versatile in all those seasons where you can know what to do early, and then your tactics evolve and they're totally different in the rut. And then I think the last 3 bucks I've shot in Michigan have all been December. One was December 16th, December 27th, and then December 29th. So I mean, right near the end of the season. And part of that is being versatile and well-rounded, but another part is just being willing to grind it out and stick at it, because it doesn't always happen the first couple of days, and sometimes it's just a matter of staying after it and staying motivated and getting up every morning and kind of just making it happen at some point, to where a lot of guys are fizzled out and kind of gave up on it. And by the late season, there's usually not much for people out, and I actually really like that time of the year. So just being able to, I've always prided myself in that, where I'm willing to sometimes outwork the other guy, but to also be consistent in a variety of different environments. I think last year I thought I was going to kill him one way, and that totally fizzled out, and in the rut it was hot, and had to totally change my plan and make a different move. And I think for guys who are looking to find success, and especially public land is one of the greatest tools out there, because you can make mistakes and it doesn't matter. You can just move on to a different area. But at the same point, you can have a handful of really good spots that are consistent. But let's say you have a day that, for whatever reason you think is a bad day for one of your good spots, you can still go to an area you've never been to, learn something different. All your main spots could be in wooded areas, and then you can take a day and just screw around in a swamp and see if you can figure something out, because it's amazing how much you can learn from just stepping outside of your comfort zone and trying something different and trying to evolve your toolbox and get more versatile in a bunch of different situations.
Deer, one thing I wanted you to touch on just on this episode, in your area of Michigan, I didn't know this until you were doing your seminar, but on public land, people are allowed to bait. Can you talk about a lot of the states in the Southeast, baiting is pretty prominent in a lot of states that allow it, which there's quite a few states in the Southeast that allow baiting, not on public land, but on private land. We have a lot of listeners that hunt both public and private. When you're dealing with people that are also running bait, and maybe you're not the kind of guy, you're not necessarily running bait, how do you use that pressure and that those bait piles as something to kind of key off of knowing where people are at and how those bucks are going to potentially come in there, but that pressure is going to keep those deer in a certain area? Can you talk a little bit about that and that buffer zone that you've kind of learned when it comes to where bait piles will be put out and how those deer use them and how you can kind of use it to your advantage?
So baiting's the easiest way to make a crappy spot okay and a really good spot average. Because if you find an awesome spot and you start baiting, then you've totally changed the dynamic of that spot. You can't really even hunt it in the morning because they're gonna be there in the dark, and then you wreck it in the evening because you're gonna get busted from the deer coming in late. So you've just ruined the spot where if you just hunted it normal, you'd be able to hunt it clean. And sometimes in the big woods, you end up pounding a spot where you might sit it 2-3 days in a row if the wind's right and you don't think that anything's crossing your trail or there's not being any detriment, because those deer are really nomadic where they might disappear for a week. So it's almost like if you don't see anything for a couple days in a row, your chances are almost getting better as long as you're hunting clean and getting in the way you need to get in. So with bait, especially in the big woods area where there's no ag, so there's no predictable food, so there's nothing really that's holding deer other than browse. So if you can get your understanding of browse up, you can identify these areas. But even with without that, the bait piles are going to hold does. So if other people are holding the does and the family groups, there's going to have to be transition areas around there where the bucks are going to cruise, where they might not be inclined to actually go into the bait, but they're going to check the trails going in and out. So if you can hunt just off of those and use those basically as, a pinpoint food location, almost like treat them like a feed tree, somebody else's feed tree, and you're just trying to catch the deer going in and out of there. And a lot of times the bigger bucks are only going to go there at night, so you can identify what bedding's close, and if you can get something on cameras, you end up having to use more in the lower deer density areas. You almost have to use more cameras just because it's harder to find a big buck. Like if I go out of state to a good state, then you just hunt the best spots and the best terrain, and more than likely there's one there. But you could have the best terrain features up there and it could just not have an older class deer. So the hardest part's finding them. Once you can find them, then you can at least narrow down an area and start to attack it. And I think that's what starts to intimidate a lot of people more, because when you're talking about hunting 50,000 acre pieces, it's like, where do you begin? Well, you narrow it down to a 40 acre piece and figure that out and branch out from there. You can't try to bite off more than you can chew with attacking too much, but that's where cameras can help. And I like to, in the big woods, if I can have a spot where I can check a couple cameras before I'm going to that area, then it's almost like you hunted 3 different spots that day, because you got intel from this spot, you got intel from this spot, and then you got whatever you observed at the other spot. And you can kind of get more information for what you're going to do moving forward, because I think information ends up killing deer, especially through the course of a year. If you're able to get that intel and make good decisions and react to what you're seeing, you're going to be way more successful than if you're limited to time where you can only hunt one day here or one day there. Success comes very random, and I think that might limit a lot of guys where they just don't have the time or the desire to kind of get after it the way you need to sometimes.
Absolutely. Dieter, as a way to wrap up as we're breaking down the show and everything around us, so a little background noise for everybody out there, but as a way to wrap up this episode and wrap up the show and your interview, what would be a piece of advice you'd give people in order to kind of start focus on for this season? If they haven't had consistent success finding mature bucks, what would you tell them to focus on to hopefully get them on the straight and narrow path start building confidence in having some of that success?
I think there's so much great information out there that sometimes becomes information overload, where you have to hunt your own hunt. Like if everybody's telling you have to go 2 miles deep and you're probably not going to go that deep, then there's no point in even scouting those areas. Go scout the areas you're likely to hunt your own hunt. You can do it. You can have success a million different ways. You just have to, take the information you're getting. You might take a little information from this guy, a little bit of information from this guy, and put it all together in your own kind of style. And the big thing is to be confident in what you're doing. Whatever your reason is for making a decision, you gotta stick with it. Mm-hmm. And when you're in the tree, the worst thing you can do is not be confident in what you're doing, because then you're not going to be paying attention. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to come in sloppy. You're going to make noise, and basically you're going to be your own worst enemy by not being confident in what you're doing. If you were 100% sure that there's going to be a big buck walk underneath your tree, your approach would be spot on. You'd be quiet going up the tree. You'd pay attention when you're in the tree. You'd sit there till the last minute of shooting light, and you'd hunt a clean hunt. But if you don't have confidence, then you get sloppy and make mistakes, and then if you were to get an opportunity, most likely you're going to blow it. So that'd be my one advice, was take what you can from different people, hunt your own hunt, and then when you make your decision, stick with it and have confidence in what you're doing.
Awesome. Dieter, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Hopefully we're excited to get you on the podcast here maybe in the next month or two, talk a little bit more about scent. I think that'd be an interesting discussion for us to have. But appreciate everybody listening to this podcast. Appreciate everybody watching as well on YouTube. And we'll catch y'all back for the next episode from the Southern Outdoorsman Podcast.